Gentlemen at the back, you can sit in the row forward if you wish. Or you're being brought a chair now. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this second throw of the dice of this planning committee. My personal apologies for not being in the first meeting. However, I can assure you I watched it avidly, including an hour and a half of everyone milling around the chamber. So moving on, whilst I have to read these opening comments, so bear with me, whilst the current restrictions remain in place, all meetings must be conducted in a COVID-secure manner, which means there is limited spaces available for members of the public to view the meeting in person. This meeting is therefore being conducted using hybrid equipment, which continues to allow officers and other parties to participate externally and join the meeting virtually. For those of us present within the council chamber, whilst the current COVID restrictions remain in place or advice remains in place, all meetings must be conducted in a COVID secure manner, which means social distancing must be followed with people remaining 2 metres apart. On entering and moving around the civic suite, follow the one-way system with masks worn at all times unless you're exempt. Do not congregate in corridors, go straight to your seat. You may remove your face mask once seated. May I remind everyone present that this meeting will be broadcast live via the internet and the record will be archived for future viewing. To support this hybrid approach, we are continuing to use the WebEx system this evening, as set out in the agenda papers and on the website. Any members of the press and public who are unable to be here in person may listen to proceedings on this meeting via a web link which has been published on the council website. The participants in this meeting will be the councillors concerned, the officers advising the committee, and any members of the public or ward members registered to speak in the public speaking arrangements. Registered speakers will be able to address the meeting when invited to do so, either in person or remotely via the WebEx platform. If there is any issues with connections during the particular speaking opportunity, or registered speaker has informed us in advance that they will not be using the facility, officers will be able to read out any written statement that the registered speaker has submitted. Any additional material will be presented over and above the verbal presentations, and the written statements will be accepted as supporting PowerPoint that can be displayed to members during the meeting. May I remind officers and members participating this evening that during the meeting, all participants are in control of their own microphones. You must place your microphone on mute whilst not speaking on an item, as I, as chairman, will use my discretion as to the order in which participants speak and will announce whom I wish to speak. The nominated speaker should then unmute their microphone and mute it after they finish their contribution. With regards to declarations, if a declaration is required after the meeting has started, this should be announced in the usual manner. With regard to voting, I remind members of the committee that you are only allowed to participate in the vote if you have been present for the whole agenda item, including the officer's presentation and debate. The usual procedures apply to debate during the consideration of agenda items, and I, as chairman, will have absolute discretion. With regard to adjournments, if I, as chairman, wish to adjourn the meeting at any point, I will announce the adjournment and inform you how long the adjournment will be. All participants are accessing the meeting via the WebEx platform should remain in the WebEx meeting facility with your microphone meeting. I confirm that at the meeting this evening, we have the following members as listed on the agenda paper: Councillor Mrs. Allen, Councillor Butler, Councillor Caldwell, Councillor Clements, Councillor Cole, Councillor Davis, Councillor Goff, myself, Councillor Grinsell as chairman, and I believe we have one apology. Mr. Acton.
There's one apology from Councillor Ryan with Councillor Hall-Allen as substitute.
Thank you. Any declarations of interest? No. Item 3, requests of members to address the meeting.
There are a couple this evening from Councillor Tony DeSico on the application 00471, which is to do with Waste Lane, and the application 00473 at Hall Meadow Road. There's also one from Councillor Ken Alsop on application 00276 Station Road, although he's unable to be present and wishes for his statement to be read out.
Thank you. Item 4, questions and deputations. I understand we do have a deputation.
Yes, Chairman. The deputation is from the CPRE Warwickshire, and it reads: CPRE Warwickshire expresses concern over application 00276 for a certificate of lawfulness for works to create site access for HS2 purposes off Hall Meadow Road and Station Road, Berkswell. No environment impact assessment was commissioned for the site, which occupies greenbelt land. The destruction of the natural environment on site is heartbreaking. High-value sedge beds, wetland habitats, mature trees, hedgerows and vegetation have all been destroyed. The cumulative impacts of flooding have not been investigated and alone preclude the award of certificate of lawfulness. The loss of irreplaceable ecology, ecosystems and the biodiversity they support will not recover in our lifetime. HS2 Limited's promises of a net zero project are disingenuous and unsustainable. HS2 Limited neither own or have control of the majority of land they want to develop. The site is out of their control and is undeliverable. Technical issues, flawed design and logistics, and the failure to provide accurate and effective assessments also renders it undeliverable. The above precludes the award of a certificate of lawfulness, even if the land was under HS2's control. It also renders the use of Hall Meadow Road as a haul route undeliverable. The above confirms HS2's monumental lack of competence and probity. Their disregard of the law is willful. The affected residents of Borsall Common, Berkswell and the wider community are the losers. They deserve better. They deserve answers. HS2 has not only destroyed the local environment, but also the day-to-day lives of all those directly affected. Please make HS2 Limited, the Secretary of State and the government stand up and be counted. This gives them a golden opportunity to do the right thing and provide the promised temporary crossing of the West Coast Main Line to enable the continuous cross-country trace line haul route to be built to remove construction traffic from the residential roads and lanes of Borsall Common and Berkswell. CPRE Warwickshire believes approval of application 00276 is legally unsound and should be refused. CPRE Warwickshire asks you to vote to refuse application 00473, which is also unsound and undeliverable. Finally, CPRE Warwickshire pleads with you to vote to refuse application 00471 to ensure the government belatedly approves construction of the promised continuous trace line haul route. You have the future health, safety and well-being of affected residents in your hands this evening. Vote to refuse the application. That ends CPRE Warwickshire's
Thank you,
deputation.
Mr. Acton. Item 5 is the Planning Committee forward, which is for noting, which I'm sure members will have noted. And before we get on to the substantive items, this is very complex. There's a lot of crossovers. So I'm going to ask Mark Andrews to give us a brief overview. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Chair. Just to share the slides there for everyone to see. Thank you. Members will be aware that this evening's agenda includes 2 requests for approval under Schedule 17 of the High Speed Rail Act. In particular, both Schedule 17 proposals relate to lorry routes to support the construction of the new high-speed rail line. The first relates to a route proposed via the A452 Kenilworth Road, Kelsey Lane, Waste Lane, Hodgetts Lane and Trudgest Lane. The second relates to an alternative route proposed via the A452 Kenilworth Road and Hall Meadow Road. The alternative route is also supported by a separate application seeking a certificate of lawfulness for proposed use or development for the creation of an access road off of the Station Road, Hall Meadow Road traffic island. Whilst the lorry routes are to be determined under the HS2 Act, the certificate of lawfulness remains to be determined under the Planning Act. The fourth application this evening relates to the bringing into use of a diversion to the Kenilworth Greenway. Whilst I do not wish to diminish the importance of that final proposal, I wanted to provide a brief introduction to the first 3 items on this evening's agenda. Members will no doubt already be aware from having reviewed the reports before you this evening and having had initial discussions at the previously deferred committee meeting of the 30th of June, that the first 3 items to a degree share some similarities and potentially bring with them some linkages. The details for each proposal will be presented in their respective order on the agenda, and due to some variation between legislation, each item is still proposed to be determined on its own merits and in turn. Instead, this initial opening presentation is intending to draw out some of those similarities up front to help provide some further clarity and background information to why these applications are before us this evening. Titled this the legal bit, so for which I apologise. So with regards to the two Schedule 17 requests for approval, these are to be determined in accordance with paragraph 6 of Schedule 17 of the High Speed Rail Act. In that context, the areas for debate are limited. For example, the principle of a lorry route to serve the construction of the railway is already accepted. The key is ensuring that the lorry route operates in a way that is in accordance with the environmental statements, environmental minimum requirements and code of construction practice that underpin and support the implementation of the Act. In that respect, Part A of this legislation is not really relevant to these applications as it relates to other proposals under the Act. So for the purpose of this application, members are invited to focus on Part B when considering any matters to which they have concerns. In this respect, the wording of the legislation is currently shown on the screen and can be read on page 21 of the agenda pack. The specific focus is therefore the ability to provide reasonable, evidenced and justified modifications to preserve the local environment or local amenity, prevent or reduce prejudicial effects on road safety or on the free flow of traffic in the local area, or preserve a site of archaeological or historic interest or nature conservation value. The certificate of lawfulness for proposed use or development is a separate matter to the HS2 Act and is considered under Section 192 of the Town and Country Planning Act. As such, it seeks to determine whether or not planning permission is required to create a site construction access for use by HS2 on land outside of the Act limits. This is broadly consistent with any planning permission which may require the use of land outside of its red line boundary to support the construction of the site on a temporary basis. The context of the legislation, however, means that the merits of the proposal are not for consideration and that this is purely a legal test. The linkages. So the base scheme and the focus of expected lorry movements through the environmental statement is the route along Waste Lane, Kelsey Lane. This is shown in blue here on this plan. This accepted the principle of up to 300 lorry movements per day along this route to support the construction programme. The route is shown in blue on the plan. During HS2's early engagement with the local community and stakeholders, however, it was suggested that Hall Meadow Road could potentially provide an alternative to Kelsey Lane Waste Lane, which would reduce the number of lorry movements along the A452 through Balsall Common Village. Hall Meadow Road was also identified as a construction traffic route within the ES and is shown as the green route on this plan. It's just around here. However, the ES identified access to compounds from Waste Lane, and so at that time, there was not an expectation for larger numbers of lorry movements along Hall Meadow Road. There was also the issue of securing a suitable access point into the development area given the lack of connection to land within the Act limits. As such,
If anyone who's not in the meeting has their microphones on, can I request you turn them off, please?
as such,
I need to say, Chairman, the last two meetings I was at, exactly the same thing happened like this. I think they went down there and sorted it, but.
the Hall Meadow Road. Okay. I'll continue, if that's okay, Chair.
Please do.
As such, the Hall Meadow Road option requires the creation of a temporary site access road, which is shown by the yellow dashed line, on land outside of the Act limits. Act limits on this image broadly followed the hedgerow to the south of the West Coast Main Line, but exclude the properties fronting Station Avenue, which is shown here. The creation of the access would allow vehicles to reach the continuous haul road from Hall Meadow Road. The legal principle of this connection is covered by the Certificate of Lawfulness before you this evening, whilst the lorry route that approaches that access point is broadly shown as the red line and is subject to the second Schedule 17 proposal before you this evening. Members will be aware from the plan on page 63 of the agenda pack and from the reports itself that a number of concerns have been raised regarding the impacts on Anora House and some of the other properties in the immediate vicinity of the junction at Station Avenue and Hall Meadow Road. This will be discussed later in the respective presentations. However, it is important to stress at this stage that matters of noise and mitigation associated with this area aren't material considerations for either application and are covered through other legislation and obligations already secured by High Speed Rail Act. Whilst Hall Meadow Road would clearly provide an alternative to the Waste Lane Kelsey Lane route, it should also be noted that if members are minded to approve the Hall Meadow Road option, this will not remove the need for the Kelsey Lane Waste Lane route altogether, but it would significantly reduce the number of lorry movements through the village. Members will note this is highlighted in the table on page 15 of your report pack. In short, the construction traffic associated with the construction of a new railway line must be able to access the work sites to deliver the project that has been granted permission through the High Speed Rail Act. The submissions before you are what has been put forward by the applicants as being the most suitable arrangements for achieving this need. These have not been accepted by your officers at face value, but have been subject to more than 7 months of analysis, critique and debate. They build on previous lorry route activity within the village and through the identification of the Hall Meadow Road route as an alternative, have sought to spread the load and reduce the impact on the Kenilworth Road, including through the main highway junctions, the village centre and past the local school. We would acknowledge, however, that Hall Meadow Road is not the only alternative option that has been presented. And this brings us on to the potential for refusals. If the local planning authority is minded to refuse the lorry route arrangements, then it needs to provide evidence. This evidence needs to relate to the grounds identified under Schedule 17 as referenced earlier and before you on the screen. The LPA must also demonstrate how the proposals can be modified, i.e. what is the alternative, whilst also bearing in mind any such modification must be reasonable in terms of deliverability. As explained within the reports, the lorry routes proposed are considered to be the quickest and easiest means of facilitating access for construction traffic to the work sites on the most suitable public roads from the strategic road network. Looking at the wider area, other options from the A45, A46 and M40 would involve longer journeys on A or B roads, which are not as suitable as the A452 and often pass through even more highly populated areas and numerous villages. A consistent alternative route presented through consultation has been the creation of a temporary crossing of the West Coast Main Line to allow for a continuous haul route, largely away from the public highway. Such a route would leave the A452 at Park Lane, just to the north side here. Cross Lavender Hall Lane before dipping south and following the route of the trace until such time as it reaches the area around the Trudgis Lane Farm Bridge. At this point, it would need to cross the West Coast Main Line either by way of the existing farm bridge or the creation of a temporary structure. It would then rejoin the Hall Road currently served from Waste Lane. The plan shows a broad indication of how this route could operate. The following plan then shows how the alternative route, shown here as a dashed purple line, would broadly compare to the routes already referenced and proposed, which were the blue and the green lines previously referenced. Officers completely recognise the level of public support for this alternative route and have challenged HS2 on its deliverability. In order to secure such a route, however, there are a number of significant issues which alone may curtail such an option, but when grouped together means your officers have been unable to accept it as a reasonable and justified alternative to the routes before us tonight. I'm sure these will be debated further this evening. However, by way of summary, such a route would generate significant numbers of lorry movements in addition to those identified by the new railway itself. This would reflect the need to construct additional parts of the haul road across areas currently not suited to handling large, heavy lorries. It would raise the sustainability implications by increasing carbon emissions beyond that which is considered necessary to deliver the project, which would reflect in an upturn in mileage and additional lorry trips. There would be a requirement for a new bridge over the West Coast Main Line as the existing farm bridge at Trudgis Lane is not suitable. This has been confirmed by Network Rail, and the creation of a temporary bridge would require additional earthworks and lorry movements outside of the haul route to secure its construction. As a result, this could have significant environmental impacts at Berkswell Pool and Fisheries, which have not yet been considered under such a purpose. Together, these issues would cause substantial delay with a 3-year allowance for bridging the West Coast Main Line alone and bring with it significant additional cost. This would mean that local residents would be living with these works for an even longer period of time than is currently planned. It would also fail to reflect the fact that one of the key purposes of these lorry routes before you tonight is to manage the movement of material to support the construction of the planned permanent bridge over the West Coast Main Line, which is an essential component of the high-speed rail project. The image before you now shows approximately where that bridge will be constructed in the blue circle. It also shows the location of the Trudgis Lane Farm Bridge, shown in orange, which has been discounted following discussions with Network Rail. A further 2 broad locations were investigated by the applicant for the creation of a temporary bridge to the west or to the east of the trace. These are broadly shown in red on this plan. Both have been discounted due to part, at least, to the reasons identified above. We will, of course, revisit many of these issues as we consider each application. That brings to an end the introductory presentation, but we hope you have found this initial introduction helpful in setting the scene for the proposals to come. Before handing over to the Chair for the first substantive item, if I may, I will hand to our legal officer to clarify the position with regards to the determination of applications, and then hand to Mr Acton to read an overarching representation that Mr Sakir Bharti MP has requested be read out at this evening's meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I just want to remind members that each application needs to be determined in accordance with its merits. All 4 applications are separate and different in their own right, although they may be interlinked in some way. If one application is not approved, it doesn't mean that the others need to follow in the same way. As members are aware, refused applications can be overturned at subsequent appeal. Therefore, please consider each application as a standalone application and determine it in accordance with its merits. Thank you.
The objections of Sakib Bhatti MP. On behalf of my constituents, I'm writing to object to the Schedule 17 planning applications above on the grounds of environmental impact, noise, road safety and air pollution. I would be grateful if this letter could be passed on to the Planning Committee and recorded as part of the consideration process. It is my view that HS2 Limited and its contractor, BBV, have exercised serious disregard for the community of Borsall Common. Despite representations indicating that their intention is to work with communities, I have found both HS2 Limited and BBV wanting in this regard, and I have listed my reasons for this. The significant increase in the number of vehicles proposed will result in congestion on local roads and will be detrimental to air quality in a residential area. Hall Meadow Road itself is unsuitable in terms of the proposed increase in traffic volume and will be dangerous for pedestrians and residential traffic. There is no provision in the plans for overspill parking at Berkswell Station. This had been repeatedly promised to the residents of Borsall Common, but this promise has not been kept. Instead, these applications will result in a loss of amenity for Borsall Common residents with no replacement. This is simply not good enough and falls short of the commitment that HS2 made to be a good neighbour. In the HS2 Community Engagement Strategy, HS2 states, "Our aspiration is to be a good neighbour every single day by respecting the people and communities we impact and being sensitive to their needs, earning our social licence to operate." HS2 Limited and BBV's conduct in relation to the people of Borsall Common has not been that of a good neighbour, and they have failed to earn their social licence to operate. These applications will also directly impact one local business, the Anora Guest House, where the route will run just a few metres from their boundary and is facing the possibility of closure as a result due to the noise, dust and constant construction traffic that will result. Neither HS2 Limited nor BBV Limited have come up with adequate proposals to mitigate the impact on Anora Guest House. Schedule 17.6.5 of the HS2 Act 2017 states the relevant planning authority may only refuse to approve arrangements for the purpose of this paragraph on the grounds that B. The arrangements ought to be modified. 1. To preserve the local environment or local amenity. 2. To prevent or reduce prejudicial effects on road safety or on the free flow of traffic in the local area, and are reasonably capable of being so modified. The applications that have been submitted will impact on the local environment and the local amenity with the increasing volume of HGV movements on local roads near to residential properties and schools, and will affect the free flow of traffic in the local area. In particular, application 00471 proposes up to 200 HGVs on the A452, the main arterial route through the village, and then routes along residential roads, Kelsey Lane, Waste Lane, with some continuing on the narrow rural lanes of Hodgetts Lane and Truggis Lane. This volume of HGVs on residential roads and rural lanes is inherently unsafe. There has been a failure to evaluate creditable alternatives which have now been put forward by local residents and parish councils for a number of years. I have now attended several meetings with HS2, BBV and members of the community at which HS2 Limited and BBV have offered to go away and look again at the problem, only for them to return and put forward the exact same damaging proposals. In my view, the approach of HS2 Limited and BBV has been to use these meetings as a way of ignoring the legitimate concerns of the local community rather than to work with them to find collaborative ways forward. There is a clear alternative by providing a continuous trace line haul route using the Truggis Hill Farm Bridge or a temporary structure that will remove construction traffic from the local road and lane networks. This would mitigate many of the concerns residents are highlighting, i.e. a huge increase in HGVs on local residential roads and increased air pollution. The provision of the cross-country haul route over the West Country Main Line would remove large numbers of HGVs and other associated construction traffic off residential roads and narrow lanes and appears to be a viable option. The alternative route could and should be given more consideration. This would have less environmental impact, cause less environmental damage and less impact on the health, safety and well-being of my constituents living on the proposed residential and rural lane haul routes. The alternative route will keep large volumes of traffic away from Borsall Common and off local roads altogether. With compounds already established at Park Lane and Waste Lane, an internal haul route rather than using public roads would minimise further disruption for residents. You'll be aware that a petition has been launched by local residents against these applications, which now totals over 3,700 signatures. The strength of this petition is a damning indictment of the attitude that HS2 Limited and BBV have had towards the residents of Borsall Common. There is clearly significant local opposition to this planning application, and I stand with my constituents who are rightly worried. And that ends the statement.
Thank you, Mr. Acton. One more thing from me before we get into the substantive items. There is an awful lot of registered speakers this evening. I know that you've all been made aware of what timescales you are allowed to speak. That's 3 minutes for a registered speaker and 4 minutes for either a parish councillor or a ward councillor. I will be keeping very strict eye on those timings. In fact, the amber indicator will come on at 15 seconds prior to the end of your time, and I will intervene 15 seconds later when the red light comes on. I would also request that when you're making your representations, that they are generally, I accept that there could be crossovers, but I would actually like you to keep to the substantive item that we are considering at that point in time. So, moving on to the first substantive item, which is the Waste Lane application on pages 5 to 40 of our packs. I'm handing over to officers to give us the brief on that particular application. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Members will recall that the request for lorry routes in and out of Waste Lane compounds and also Carroll Green compound on Trugis Lane was deferred from the 30th of June Planning Committee for the following reasons. To understand a greater understanding of traffic movement data, suitability of roads, for example, the width and types of vehicle in terms of road safety and impact on pedestrians, including children going to and from school, whether all alternative options have been explored, matters of environment and pollution, and monitoring and compliance responsibilities. And the applicants have provided further information to address these points, and they're summarised within the reports at pages 11 to 16. This is a Schedule 17 request for approval, and it's seeking consent for a lorry route for a maximum of 200 two-way movements per day travelling from the strategic road network inbound from the A45 along the A452 through Borsall Common before turning left onto Kelsey Lane, which becomes Waste Lane, and onto Hodgetts Lane and Trugis Lane to access the work sites as part of HS2's main works. And the outbound journey would be the reverse of this route. Lorry route approvals are required when there is an excess of 24 large goods vehicle movements per day, which is 12 in and 12 out. And large goods vehicles are the larger HGVs. So, for example, over 7.5 tonnes in gross vehicle weight. Lorry routes only need approval from the strategic road network, and in this case, it's the A45. To recap, if I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. As Mark Andrews has already advised, the matters for consideration for a Schedule 17 request for lorry routes are that the local planning authority may only refuse to approve arrangements on the grounds that the arrangements relate to the development which, for the purposes of regulating the matter in question, ought to and can be reasonably considered in conjunction with development which has deemed planning permission under Section 20 and which is to be carried out in the local authority's area, or B, that the arrangements ought to be modified to preserve local environment or local amenity, to prevent or reduce prejudicial effects on road safety or the free flow of traffic in the local area, or to preserve a site of archaeological or historic interest or nature conservation value, and are reasonably capable of being so modified. Have the next slide, please. So this image shows the proposed lorry route from the strategic road network, and lorries would travel down the A452 through Borsall Common Village, turn left onto Kelsey Lane, which turns into Waste Lane, and onto the work sites at Waste Lane, Hodgetts and Truggis Lane. Have the next slide, please. And this plan here shows the routes in more detail, with the majority of lorries stopping at the Waste Lane access, and then they'd either stop at that compound or continue to Carroll Green South and Cromwell Lane compounds using an internal haul road. A small number of vehicles would continue to Carroll Green North compound, and that's located off Truggis Lane. Have the next slide, please. So in terms of the additional data that HS2 have supplied, this is on road widths and vehicle types, and that's summarised in this slide. Kelsey Lane, for the most part, is greater than 6 metres in width and has footpaths on either side of the road. Waste Lane is slightly wider at approximately 6.7 metres as the road leaves the built-up part of the village, and the applicants have advised that the width of a typical construction vehicle is 2.6 metres. Further information has also been provided, and it's summarised in the report, that demonstrates that the capacity of these roads was assessed through the environmental statement, and the environmental statement demonstrated that there would be surplus capacity on the A45, Kelsey Lane and Waste Lane, even with construction traffic being taken into account. Have the next slide, please. A swept path analysis has been provided by the applicants to demonstrate that an articulated vehicle could turn onto the A452 onto Kelsey Lane without encroaching onto oncoming traffic or footpaths. The next slide. Moving on to the images, this shows the A45 on the approach to Borsall Common Village from the north, just after the traffic island with Hall Meadow Road. And the next one, please. And this one is the A452 at the village centre, just before the main traffic island with Kenilworth Road. And the next. This is the B4101 at Kelsey Lane, where it enters Waste Lane, and lorries would continue on the B4101 at this bend. And the next. Cute. This image shows the B4101 Waste Lane as it heads out of the built-up part of Borsall Common towards the Waste Lane site compound. And the next slide shows the compound entrance on Waste Lane. The next image is the junction of Hodgetts Lane and Truggis Lane, where LGVs would turn left onto Carroll Green North compound. And the final image is Truggis Lane looking towards Carroll Green North compound. So if I could have the next slide. Thank you. So the background to this submission, it should be borne in mind that the environmental statement to the HS2 Act accepted up to 300 two-way movements per day along this route to Waste Lane. And this request for approval proposes 200 two-way movements per day at its peak. Of those, 24 two-way movements could take place without the need for approval from the local planning authority. In considering this request, it should also be noted that a lorry route for 100 movements utilising this route was approved in 2019 for HS2 early works. Officers are unaware of any complaints having been made to the local authority for the use of this route from early works. And should this request be approved, HS2 are contractually bound by environmental minimum requirements, which includes a code of construction practice, which contains relevant requirements linked to the delivery of the lorry route to ensure that impacts which would have been assessed in the environmental statement won't be exceeded. Looking at the grounds for consideration of the request, the work sites to which this lorry route is required are identified within the Act, so it meets Part A of the grounds for consideration. Focusing on local environment and amenity, the key issues as detailed in the report are noise and air quality. These impacts were accepted for the route in the environmental statement, and that's for a greater number of vehicles than now proposed. In terms of environment and air quality, the applicants have provided a fact sheet that was originally shown at the HS2 Implementation Advisory Group, chaired by Solihull MBC. The assessment of air quality and environment is as per the original report that you had in the June meeting. In terms of compliance with environmental minimum requirements, HS2 is bound into these arrangements under the HS2 Development Agreement of 2014, as amended in 2017, with the Secretary of State for Transport. And the Secretary of State has also given an undertaking to Parliament, the breach of which would be contempt, that he would secure compliance with the environmental minimum requirements. Have the next, please. In terms of the scope for modifications, while officers don't consider that a modification to be needed, an alternative approach to this lorry route has been suggested through third-party representations, being a continuous off-road haul route. Officers have explored this option further with HS2 and Network Rail, who both advise that the current access arrangements involving crossing an existing substandard farm accommodation bridge over the West Coast Main Line are unsuitable. The provision of a temporary crossing would not be considered reasonable due to the extensive works and additional effects to facilitate this. The suggested alternative, therefore, is considered to fall outside of the scope of the Act. And if I could have the next, please. Hall Meadow Road has also been identified as a possible alternative, and as you'll be aware, that's subject to a later item on the agenda. It's important to point out, however, that if that submission was approved, this route for Waste Lane would still be required, especially during construction and demobilisation of the Hall Road. However, once the Hall Road is in operation, it would significantly reduce numbers of lorries using Waste Lane. It was explained previously why the continuous haul road was not considered reasonable. The applicants have provided more information on how the two routes would work together in terms of numbers, and they've also provided predicted timescales, and the information is in the report. If the local planning authority were to find this route unsuitable, it would need to provide evidence that the route ought to and could reasonably be modified on the grounds identified by Schedule 17 of the Act. There is no evidence to suggest that this route would cause any additional harm to that identified within the environmental statement, which is accepted by the Act. The report sets out why the off-road haul route cannot be provided as an alternative, and the only other option would be to use other less favourable routes within the wider highway network. Routes from elsewhere on the strategic road network, for example, the A46, M40 or M42, would involve longer routes on A and B roads, often travelling through higher densely populated areas or passing through a higher number of settlements. And on this basis, the update note and report details why, having regard to the parameters within which the arrangements for lorry routes can be considered, the proposals are considered acceptable, and as such, the recommendation is one of approval. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we move on to the registered speakers. The first being Barry and Sarah Howarth, and I understand we have a statement to be read. Mr. Acton.
Thank you, Chairman. The use of HS2 LGV construction traffic will have detrimental impacts on the village and rural roads on this proposed route, including the smaller number of vehicles that will be continuing from the compound on Waste Lane through to Truggis Lane. The road junction at Hodgetts Lane and Waste Lane is renowned for numerous serious traffic collisions over the last few years, the latest occurring on the 20th of July. The extra traffic will only escalate the issues at this junction, which could ultimately lead to further serious injury or further fatalities. Even with the addition of some recent new road signage, the problem is still there. The heavy goods vehicles that currently use the junction cut the corner, which is a danger to oncoming traffic. And this is also the case for the junction at the corner at Truggis Lane from Hodgetts. There are numerous bus stops that are used regularly on this route by residents, Our young son uses the bus stop daily on Waste Lane at the corner near Hodgetts Lane and has to stand on the edge of the road completely unprotected from the traffic. Surely the safety of local residents should be paramount, and this was indeed raised on several occasions at the last meeting. He's essentially taking his life in his hands each morning with little more than a small grass verge measured at 5 centimetres between himself and the HS2 construction traffic driving past. The HS2 traffic uses the road daily from 7 AM onwards, and we would be in agreement that there should be immediate restrictions imposed on the traffic during certain times of the day, especially at school times when children are waiting for their school bus transport, both in the morning and afternoon. Traffic is also not adhering to the speed limit of the roads in use. On the 20th of July, 2 HS2 vehicles travelling in convoy were followed coming out of the compound on Waste Lane in the direction of Kelsey and were recorded travelling in excess of 35 miles an hour down Kelsey Lane to the traffic lights with the A452. On the 21st of July, another HS2 lorry was followed along Waste Lane doing in excess of 46 miles an hour towards the Waste Lane compound in a 40-mile-an-hour zone, passing both a cyclist and a pedestrian en route. As we all know, speed kills, and this is not at all acceptable on any level. How is this going to be monitored to ensure the safety of other road users and residents? These routes are currently used by a high number of cyclists, pedestrians and horses who have to walk in the road due to a lack of provision of a footpath on a big stretch of Waste Lane and no provision at all on the Hodgetts Lane stretch leading to Truggis Lane. There are a number of local liveries that use this route, and horses are regularly seen being walked along these routes with traffic approaching at speed and not giving enough distance between themselves and the horse and rider, which will cause a horse to jolt. Again, another accident waiting to happen. On this application route, there are 2 very narrow bridges, one on Waste Lane and one on Hodgetts Lane. Both are too narrow for 2 construction vehicles to traverse and pass at the same time, or indeed HS2 LGV to pass another vehicle, or indeed even a cyclist safely. With both bridges, there is no option at all to provide a temporary widening. This issue will remain and will be a danger to oncoming road users in both directions. You're not able to see the oncoming traffic until you're at the very top of the field.
Thank you, Mr. Acton. To be fair to all the other speakers, I've already said I'm going to be fairly strict on timing, so we will curtail that statement further. The second speaker, Mrs. Cooper. Welcome, Mrs. Cooper. You have 3 minutes, as you know. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We are not here to decide the merits or otherwise of the HS2 project. The day-to-day lives of affected Borsal Common, Berkswell and wider community residents are what will be decided by you this evening. The strength of feeling within the affected communities is understandably high. Our daily lives, safety, health and well-being, and that of our children and grandchildren is already negatively affected by HS2 construction, traffic, pollution and road safety issues. Our champions include 2 confirmed supporters of the HS2 project, Andy Street, the West Midlands Mayor, and Saki Bharti, our local MP. Both recognise the appalling way we have been treated by HS2 Limited and have objected on our behalf. Their objections and those of our ward councillors are material considerations and should carry significant weight. The shortcomings of HS2 give a window of opportunity for them to do the right thing by us. We ask this planning committee to send an unequivocal message to HS2 Limited and the government to think again and provide a continuous cross-country haul route using a temporary crossing of the West Coast Main Line or refurbish the accommodation bridge which is existing. Hall Meadow Road and land on Barrett's Farm is undeliverable. HS2 Limited does not own or control the required land, and without permitted development rights, the route is outside the scope of the HS2 Act 2017. This opportunity must not be lost. We ask you to send HS2 Limited and the Secretary of State a clear message. Provide the promised continuous traceline haul route to remove the bulk of construction traffic from our residential roads and narrow lanes in Borsal Common and Berkswell. HS2 has already destroyed our environment. Please do not let them destroy our lives as well. It is offensive to read SMBC officers upholding the human rights of HS2 Limited ahead of the human rights of affected Solihull residents. Our right to peaceful enjoyment of our homes, family lives and possessions should be paramount. SMBC are democratically accountable to their residents and responsible for them. Please reject officer recommendations, refuse application 00471 on behalf of the affected residents of Borsal Common, Birksall and the wider community. There is clearly a viable alternative route. HS2 merely lacks the will to make it happen. Please vote to make it happen. Thank you.
Mrs. Cooper, thank you for being so precise in your timings. Next speaker is Richard Lloyd. Again, Mr. Lloyd, you have 3 minutes.
Do you have my presentation, please? Have the second slide up, please. And there's been reference to this bridge, number 336. It's difficult to read, but that is a report we obtained from a few years ago, a genuine Network Rail report saying that the bridge has minor defects, but it is safe for a capacity of 40 tonnes at a speed limit of 30 miles an hour and up to 2,000 vehicles a day. That is a genuine Network Rail report, not hearsay evidence. Next one, please. In 2016, HS2 got Arup to look at the condition of the bridge, and they confirmed that it was suitable. That bridge has stood for 173 years. We've had local professional engineers consider it, and they say that masonry bridges do not suddenly go from minor problems to completely unsafe. That bridge is satisfactory with minor repairs. Next slide, please. And that does provide the reasonably capable alternative that is required by Schedule 17 for you to refuse this application. The number of movements was originally going to be 280. It's now reduced to 200 each way, so that one-way operation is quite feasible on that bridge. If there are minor repairs, possibly repointing, that can be done during overnight closures, which HS2 are already doing on a Saturday night on the main railway line. They close the line on a Saturday night and do minor works there. Next, please. The question of stopping vehicles going through the parapets, that containment curbs are a standard feature. That's the Hodgetts Lane Bridge, which you've already seen pictures of, but it shows the curbing which is put in, and that road is a 40-mile-an-hour road with two-way traffic on it, and that is considered safe by Network Rail for general use. We can go on to the next picture. In question of the damage tolerance of masonry bridges, this is bridge number 343, just up the road, and you can see it doesn't look terribly good in that view. Next slide, please. And hopefully you can see that there are cracks which have been marked in chalk for subsequent repair. That bridge is being used by hundreds of high-speed trains a day, and Network Rail are quite satisfied with the condition of it. Obviously, it does need eventual repair, but it ain't going to fall down today, tomorrow, or next week. And that is in worse condition than the bridge that we've just been talking about. Next slide, please. So in terms of refusal of this application, we've had 7 years of objection to this route, during which we've had to develop the credible alternative with the help of local professional engineers who've advised us that that bridge number 336 is adequate. And using that bridge, the construction traffic can stay within the HS2 land and not go onto residential roads through Borsal Common at all.
Mr. Lloyd, you've had your 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. The next speaker is attending remotely. Mr. Payne, can you hear us and can we hear you?
Yes, I can hear you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
We can see you and we can hear you. You have 3 minutes, Mr. Payne. Thank you.
I've got a presentation, please. Is my presentation available?
Bear with us, Mr. Payne.
Thank you. You have to go down to next slide, please. Next slide. Okay. As we've been mentioned, this has been subject to extensive discussions throughout the petitioning, and the alternatives have not been accepted. We have had ongoing engagement with councillors and community up to May this year during the submission of these. Already mentioned the approval route for over 300 as was approved during the ES, and it is our objective to build a continuous haul route along the trace as soon as practical. However, under all scenarios, even use of a temporary bridge over the section, this waste lane route would still be required to be approved tonight. Through design development, and we have looked and minimise the traffic movements to 200 two-way movements per day, and should the whole meadow option be approved, then that would reduce going forward. And as mentioned before, we've already been using this route, and it was approved by SMBC in September 2019. Next slide, please. This route shows how a high-level plan of how we would construct the bridge over the West Coast Main Line, which then becomes the permanent route. That's going to take us to around Q3 23, by which time then we would have the continuous haul route over the trace that we all desire. Up until that point, though, we would need to use waste lane up to the maximum of 200 movements per day, as stated. Next slide, please. There's been lots of talk about using a temporary crossing to the east of the trace, which is the only viable place to actually build a temporary bridge. This is the high-level plan of should that be implemented. Unfortunately, the temporary bridge location would clash with the permanent works, and is therefore the actual benefit of doing this is limited amount on the temporary bridge. It also means that we would have to remove the temporary bridge before we can complete the permanent works, and that actually extends the whole of the contract. It's also noticed that actually construct this temporary bridge would take the same time as putting a permanent bridge in place at Q3 23. Next slide, please. Again, this is a slide that was presented to the councillors and the communities back in May. And it's a comparison between the baseline, which is our planned Schedule 17 lorry routes, and the temporary bridge to the east. This shows that if you put a temporary bridge in, actually, whilst there is some minor benefit from intermittent use of a haul road, it actually increases the maximum lorries movements because there's two bridges. It increases carbon, increases waste and air emissions. It also makes the construction more complicated in that there is a clash between the two. It would need more rail blockades. It delays handover to our next contract, and would cost the taxpayers in the order of between 10 and 12 million pound extra to build the bridge, remove it, and the subsequent delay cost. There's also a huge risk in terms of actually getting consent from Network Rail to actually build this. So therefore, we do not feel this is a viable alternative. Next slide, please, which is just a summary. So no evidence has been brought forward to demonstrate that the
Mr. Payne,
yep.
I'm going to be even-handed here.
Okay.
Your 3 minutes have expired. Thank you very much
That's
indeed.
just that summary. Thank you.
Next speaker is Councillor De Sico. Councillor De Sico, as you know, you have 4 minutes as ward councillor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good evening, members. This lorry route will involve up to 200 two-way HGV movements per day, excuse me, down residential roads and rural lanes. By HS2's own road design standards, most of this route is not wide enough to safely take two-way HGV traffic. The standard states a width of 6.8 metres, where buses or HGVs are likely to pass each other on a regular basis. Much of Kelsey Lane is less than 6 metres wide, with Trugis Lane being only 5.1 metres wide in parts, and the carriageway of the Hodgetts Lane Bridge over the West Coast Main Line is only 4.8 metres. We are told that usage of a part of this route will be very limited once an alternative haul route is established, but if a road is not deemed wide enough or safe for this type of HGV movement, then it is immaterial whether it is 1 or 100 movements per day. It is not safe. And don't forget that in rubber stamping these lorry movements, the vehicles have to use these residential roads and rural lanes. These will be set lorry routes that must be used regardless of the road conditions, traffic congestion, weather or pedestrian activity. But are there alternatives? Yes, indeed there are. One is already in place. We are told that vehicles must drive down Truggish Lane to access Carroll Green North compound, but a continuous haul route to this site is now in place from the Park Lane area, with consent having been given by SNBC for a managed crossing of Truggish Lane. HGVs do not need to travel down our narrow country lanes to reach this work site. In order to access the Waste Lane compounds from Carroll Green, one must cross over the West Coast Main Line. Members, you will already be aware that there are two options here that I do not believe have been fully explored, despite both being on the table for a number of years. Either a temporary bridge east of the trace line or using Truggish Hill Farm Bridge. This bridge has already been seen, has long been used for vehicles to cross over the railway. While it may not be safe for some very large vehicles not allowed on public roads, I have seen no evidence that it is not safe for smaller roadworthy vehicles to pass over it in a controlled and limited way. This lorry route is not safe. A cross-country haul route to one compound now exists. This whole planning application should therefore be rejected because HS2 Limited already has another route available. It is not right that Borsall Common and Birksall residents should have to be put up with a large amount of construction traffic on our residential roads and rural lanes because alternatives have not been fully explored by the applicant, despite them being on the table for a number of years. I urge you members to refuse this planning application.
Thank you, Councillor De Sica. Next on the list, I've got two names, but I'm not sure. Councillor Tyndall? Thank you, Councillor Tyndall. You have 4 minutes as a parish councillor. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening. I wish to submit the following on behalf of the Parish Council, Borsall Parish Council, who strongly objects to this planning application on behalf of its residents who will be badly affected by the proposed significant increase of HGV movements through its community, and in particular over our concern for the health and safety risk to children attending two major schools along the A45 route. The Borsall Parish Council fully supports the objections raised by its neighbouring Birkswell Parish Council, along with others who have called for the continuous haul route along the trace line to be used by HS2. It is therefore greatly disappointing that HS2 have not properly considered this or fully explored this option. We therefore call upon the committee to refuse this application. But however, if you see fit to approve it, we ask that the following conditions are imposed. One, that HS2 BBV are not permitted any movement of diesel HGVs during the school peak start and close hours in order to protect the health and safety of our children attending schools or on the nearby proposed A452 route. That number two, that improvements are made to the inadequate air monitoring equipment along the A452 route through Borsall Common, proposed by HS2, particularly past the village centre and the Heart of England School. A letter setting out my council's concerns over the inadequacy of air quality monitoring in Borsall Common has already been submitted to Solihull MVC, and the increase in HGVs proposed by HS2 adds greatly to our concerns. Three, that the pedestrian crossing, a pedestrian crossing is installed along the A452 between the Dengate Drive roundabout and the George in the Tree roundabout to enable people to safely cross this already busy stretch of trunk road, which will become even more hazardous if this HS2 proposal is approved. This part of the borough, that's our part of the borough, Borsal and Berkswell, is more adversely affected by HS2 than others, particularly during its long construction phase. And I ask that you give these matters your serious consideration in order to help mitigate the serious impact on our community. You have it in your power, committee, to compel HS2 to be a good neighbour, not, as our MP has said, not a good neighbour. So you have it within your power. I urge you to take on board the points that have been made this evening and ask them to reconsider their situation. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Tyndall. I'd be obliged if you could turn your microphone off. Thank you very much. Next speaker from Berkswell Parish Council, Councillor Burrow.
Good evening. I have some slides somewhere.
Councillor Burrow, can you get a little bit nearer your microphone? Thank you.
Nobody's ever accused me of speaking quietly. If I could have my first slide, please. The one after this. Thank you. Councillors might remember this slide from the last meeting showing children on Kelsey Lane and the proximity of the traffic to them. I won't go over it again. If I could have the next slide, please. Councillor De Sico mentioned the HS2's design criteria for new roads, and this is an extract from that showing that where HGVs are likely to pass each other, the road should be built to 6.8 metres wide. Now that allows room for two HGVs of 2.75 metres wide with wing mirrors able to pass each other. If I could have the next slide, please. You've skipped one, I think. We could go back, please. This shows the measurements on the Berkswell part of Kelsey Lane. I'm a Berkswell Parish Council. I don't know where HS2 took their measurements, but these are the measurements outside those individual houses, and none of them are higher than 6 metres. And the lowest is 5.8 metres. So that road is under 6 metres wide, which wouldn't allow for comfortable passing of two HGVs. If I could go on to the next slide. Because this one, the next slide shows what the problem is. That vehicle has got its wheels on the white line, but it's still quite close to the edge. It would have to pull over to the pavement side to pass another vehicle, and there is a risk of it mounting the pavement. If I could have the next slide, please. On the 2nd of November, 2018, BBV proposed the Hall Meadow Road route to remove the need to run large numbers of trucks through the centre of Balsall Common and down Kelsey Lane. That presentation sits on our website. They did not make that planning application as they promised in spring 2019. The only reason that they're seeking permission to run 200 trucks down Kelsey Lane is because they didn't make that planning application 2 years ago. They haven't had they now don't have the time to build the construction route. That's not our fault, that's their fault. And the children and residents of Balsall Common should not have to put up with having 200 trucks a day because BBV and HS2 didn't get on and do what they promised to make a planning application 2 years ago. Thank you, councillors.
Thank you very much, Councillor Burrow. That's the end of the speakers on this particular application. Therefore, it is my responsibility to start the debate. The Council's standing orders require me to move the motion, and although I am moving the motion, I am still undecided on how I will vote. Do I have a seconder?
Formally second, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Davies. Members, over to you. Councillor Gough.
Thank you, Chairman.
I've listened very intently to the speakers tonight and to all the presentations, and I've also driven the route myself. And I'm absolutely astounded that we've got this application in front of us tonight for these routes. I can't believe that the proposals for this type of vehicle to go down these small country lanes are in front of us. I'm lost for words, really.
If you're that lost for words, I'll give you a chance to rethink and hand over to Councillor Caldwell.
No, they're clearly unsafe, and I don't want to be in a position sometime in the future where I'm listening to the news or reading the newspaper and hearing about fatalities because of the the vehicles going down those roads. So I can't put my hand on my heart and support these applications. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Caldwell.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, so last month, obviously, we did have a look at this application before it became deferred and before we had to obviously adjourn the meeting until this evening. And I was looking forward to seeing if there was any new evidence or points that were brought forward. And this is, of course, why we should approach these meetings with the open mind that we all must. And there have been some new points brought forward that I think make the case very interesting. One of the most interesting points that I think was brought forward was the information brought by Mr. Lloyd regarding the bridge at Truggerstill Farm. Now, previously, my understanding was that that bridge wasn't capable of supporting the loads that it needed to be used as part of the internal haul route that has been proposed previously. But as we saw, Mr. Lloyd brought reports from Arup saying that actually it could be used on that basis. And I find that problematic because we have two completely conflicting statements about the usability of that bridge. And so one of them's got to be wrong. And I wonder which one it is. I don't know which one it is. I'm not a railway bridge expert, so I wouldn't like to speculate. But what that does mean is that I don't think we have all the information we need to make a clear recommendation of approval for this route. Now, some of the things that I did say last month, I'd just like to recap upon because I think they're important to have on the record. Firstly, as we know, we're not supposed to be judging the merits of the project here. We're supposed to be judging the merits of the planning applications. And we know HS2 is contentious. And I appreciate that much of what we've heard from our speakers on this item would be covered by the environmental statement, and that a lot of the impacts that have been spoken about have been signed off by our parliamentarians, including the member for Meriden. However, there is something that I wanted to pick up from the various presentations, is that there seems to be this implication that because something is the cheapest and quickest way of doing it, that makes it the most reasonable way of doing it. Now, if that was the case, we would be recommending fast food to our children because that's the cheapest and quickest way of getting fed. It doesn't mean it's the best way of doing it. Now, reasonability, the test of reasonableness, I think is always interesting because it effectively comes down to who can demonstrate what reasonable looks like better. And as we say, HS2 and BBV have said that they don't consider that off-road haul route to be reasonable because of the timescales, because of the cost, and so on and so forth. But as we've heard, that route has been discussed since 2016. Now, if it's going to take you 3 years to build a bridge and you know you need a bridge in 2016, why are we here in 2021 saying we need 3 years to build a bridge? That doesn't make sense to me. It feels to me very much as though the applicant has decided if we just don't do anything about this, then we can get to where we are now in the programme timeline and they'll have to approve these haul routes because there is no alternative. Well, I'm sorry, I think there is an alternative. I think it is a reasonable adjustment to the application to use internal haul route, and on that basis, I'll be voting against this application, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Caldwell. I also picked up, and I agree with you about what Mr. Lloyd said, is that do we believe one party or do we believe another party? Similarly, Councillor Burrow mentioned or gave us a list of road widths, and you'll note from your update pack that we've been given differing figures from the applicant. And I have done a little bit of research and I have read HS2's Rural Road Design Criteria PDF. How sad am I? And I have to agree exactly with what Councillor Burrows said, because that's what is quoted in that document. And even with the update note, it doesn't comply with the criteria that they've set. Councillor Hall-Allen, you wanted to ask questions or speak?
Well, I did want to speak, yes, Chair, and thank you very much for what you've just said. And I also want to support the wonderful presentations that we have heard this evening, and indeed copious times before. And where I'm sitting, sadly, as you well know, sir, I'm not now on this committee full time, so it's a pleasure for me to be here tonight at a very sensitive moment in the development that we're looking at. And I think over the years that we have done, and the councillors have come here, several of them, regularly with very, very sensible ways forward, and the hard work that they've put into looking at these various designs and concerns. And I have to say that I do not feel that HS2 has been a good neighbour to these people. It's been completely the opposite. They seem to have roughshod in a lot of ways through everybody and everything. And I do congratulate the councils that came, so the parish councils in particular, and others as well, who have also put forward ideas. I'm finding it very difficult to support the recommendation, Chair. I think it's highly likely that I won't. But it's not too late. We've got to find more alternative ways of looking at it. And I think the agenda has been pointed out this evening quite widely that there is room for the improvement of the bridge. I did go drive round again this afternoon purposely just to remind myself of the area. And many people who are here this evening know that I lived in Balsall Common for about 7 years, so not that far over. But again, I'm very concerned about the roundabout near the pub and so on. It needs seriously looking at. That is not safe. And I think what's coming out this evening very, very clearly, and I emphasise, HS2 have not been good neighbours, and they're not looking at this sensitivity and the concern and the worry of so many people about the safety of the considerations that's being considered at this moment, this evening, on this particular item on this agenda. Chairman, I don't think it's safe. It's been proven by several speakers, and I think where I should be going at the end to vote. So thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Allen.
Choice of microphones. Thank you. Yes, Chairman, thank you. Fantastic work from everybody who's given us spoken to us tonight. The thing that I am very concerned about is the health and safety. We've heard about collisions in Waste Lane. There's no reports of that in our report. Lorries cutting corners, an actual proof because you saw the lorries tyre marks on corners. School times, children standing right next to the road, lorries speeding down the road, no footpath, bridges that are too narrow for 2 lorries to go over. And that in itself is enough for me to say that this is not safe. And so thank you. That's all I have to say on that at the moment.
Councillor Cole. Thank you, Councillor Allen. Councillor Cole.
Thank you, Chair. I listened to the debate with great concern here, and I do wonder if HS2 have been a good neighbour, and it appears they may not have been. I do think the parish councils have done a lot of good work here in preparing for tonight, and the evidence they've provided is very good and quite outstanding, actually. I do have my concerns about the road widths. I've been down there myself, and they do look rather tight for 2 lorries to pass. I do have worries about school children using these roads, and I'm not really convinced that this is the way to go. I shall vote against this, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Butler.
Thank you, Chairman. I think the devil's in the detail here, and the detail is the problem. Leading on from what Councillor Caldwell said a few minutes ago regarding bridges, we have an issue there. We don't have clear, definitive data. And secondly, regarding the road widths, these are major considerations, and we have before us information provided by HS2 regarding road widths. And I'll give you an example. Meeting House Lane, number 6 on the plan, shows a width of 6.2 metres. But that is correct, because if you go onto, for example, Google Earth, which has an error rate of 0.44%, how sad is that? That is correct at that point. But if you just move slightly to the east of that, you get 5.38 metres. So there is big variations here. The devil is in the detail, and the detail seems to be lacking. This is slightly problematic. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Davis, I see you indicating we're getting a pattern here. So I hope that you're raising something new. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. All right, I'll start off with, if you imagine a nice sunny morning in Borsall Common and Berkswell, and yours truly spend a very pleasant hour and a quarter there this morning. And I'm driving down one of the lanes. Forgive me, I can't remember which one it was. And I saw one of these big lorries coming towards me. So when it's a competition between a VW Golf and a big lorry like that, you know who pulls over. And it was me. It was dangerous. There's no other word, Chairman. It was dangerous. And it wasn't doing 30 or even 40 miles an hour. In fact, I thought Lewis Hamilton was driving. It went at a good lick past me. And I have many concerns as a result of my drive round this morning. Others have perhaps said this before, so forgive me if this is repetitive. I'm concerned about lorries turning from 452 into Kelsey Lane and then back out again. Many of us will, over our years of driving, have seen piles of bricks at the side of the road where the load has shifted and come off out the side. Now, these lorries are, of course, do have sides, but they do tend to stack them up with spoil and the like. So one thing there, although I don't think it's going there, but if it were to be approved, I'd want to see a condition that all lorries had to be have their loads secured with nets in order that there's no accidents of materials falling onto the pavements, and who knows what would happen. Equally, the roundabout in the centre of Borsall Common, that's another place where you could get load shift, and something should be done there. I noticed a lot of these roads, lanes, don't have pavements, and that makes it even more dangerous. Pedestrians will be not knowing what to do if they've got a lorry come from each direction, which won't pass each other anyway, so one of them will have to stop at some point. Pollution is another thing. If this was an application for something that required 12 months of change, then we'd probably think, well, yeah, we're sorry people, but 12 months, you might have to live with that. But this is 5 years. And with the greatest respect to the people over in Borsall Common and Berkswell, some of them may not be with us in 5 years' time, and what a hell of a way to go. These lanes and some of the roads, and I'm not a highway engineer, so I make that declaration now, weren't built for fully loaded HGV lorries to go trundling up and down for 5 years. I think somebody used the word astounding. I think it was Councillor Gough. Very good word, Councillor Gough. I would go along with you totally. Mention was made, I think by Mr. Lloyd, about the bridge. If those figures that you've quoted, Mr. Lloyd, are anything near correct, then I would say to HS2, go and have a look again and take your experts with you and see what can be done about that. I'd like to know what hours of working would be proposed, and also which days work will be carried out. Monday to Friday, Monday to Saturday, nothing Sunday, bank holidays, that kind of thing. But overall, there's no doubt that this will have, as one of the authors of a letter here referred to as being a massive negative effect on Borsal Common and Berkswell. We owe, as councillors and as a planning committee, a duty of care to our residents, and we'd be failing them, frankly, if we approve this tonight. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor. I'm not going to, I think I know where we're going with all this. So I'm not going to ask officers to physically answer your questions because they would, but the other comment I would make, because we are live globally, other vehicles are available other than a Volkswagen Golf. Everything's been said that I would have asked, bar one thing that hasn't been raised there. And I think I'm like-minded with my fellow planning committee members. But the other thing that I think it might have been Councillor Burrow, why wasn't this done in 2019 and all 16? I just heard, thank you, Ms. Cooper. I'm not privy to it, but I do tend to believe what I've been presented with. And it's just astounding that this has been delayed and delayed and delayed to get to this stage where this committee is under pressure to give an affirmative recommendation rather than the feeling I get. So without any further ado, I'm going to, sorry, Mark, would you like to comment?
Thank you, Chair. And you're probably all sat there going, oh, why won't you heed what the Chair's just said about officers not responding? But apologies, councillors, apologies, speakers, apologies, everybody at home. I fear I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't respond to some of the questions that have been raised by members and some of the points that have been raised. So I feel it's only appropriate, if I may, Chair, if we can try and come back as officers to some of those points.
Briefly, Mr. Andrews.
Thank you. Firstly, road widths, I think, and again, colleagues may wish to add to this as well. There is some, I think we all accept, there are some of the roads within that route that are slightly below the 6 metres, and therefore there's question marks around the design guide. I think what's important, though, is that design guide relates to the creation of new roads. It doesn't relate to the use of existing roads as we understand that design guide. I think in terms of the bridge as well, I did just want to highlight a particular point on that bridge. We are aware that there's been other studies on it. We're aware that there's been work undertaken to it. And Mr. Lloyd's obviously identified some figures on that report, which I believe are from around 2013 or 2017. Our correspondence was 2021 with Network Rail. That fed off an assessment Network Rail undertook in 2020, which identified that the bridge had deteriorated since their last assessments were undertaken, and therefore they would not be supportive of a haul route being used over that bridge. That was up-to-date information that Network Rail provided to us because we didn't want to accept firsthand that HS2 had told us we wanted to go to the coalface, we wanted to speak to Network Rail, we wanted to hear that from them directly. In terms of the delay, completely understand that. It has been frustrating. I think it's been frustrating for everybody involved. But one of the key reasons for that delay, I think, was the notice to proceed on HS2 was not approved or not issued until 2020. So yes, there had been a lot of work in the background to try and progress things. But in terms of actually moving forward with the project, it was only when that notice to proceed was issued in 2020 that applications could come forward to us really and really start moving in terms of these sorts of works. I just think it's really important to stress that as officers, at no point have we taken this lightly. We understand, we totally understand that there is an issue here in terms of impact on local residents, on Balsall Common and Berkswell and the surrounding areas. We know there is. HS2 know there is. Everybody knows there is. The fact is we have a High-Speed Rail Act that was approved by government that is creating HS2. Works are ongoing on site now as we speak. That act allows for up to 24 lorry movements along those routes without the need for any Schedule 17 consents. So there will be lorry movements along those roads. There has been lorry movements along those roads over the last couple of years in order to undertake the initial works to try and to get the compounds and things up and running. So there has been works, there has been lorry movements, and to date, we're certainly not aware of any incidents that have been caused by those works over the last couple of years. The environmental statements, the environmental minimum requirements, the Code of Construction Practice that underpin the High-Speed Rail Act that supports the lorry movement applications that are before us now, allowed and tested for up to 300 lorry movements along that route. This application before you is up to 200. Now that figure will reduce substantially if, and it's a big if, the Hall Meadow Road route was to be brought forward. And yes, an alternative route could come along and it could be all off-road, and that would almost potentially negate the need to have the routes all together. But as you've heard from HS2, the applicant earlier on today, in order to create that haul route, there needs to be a lorry route to create that off-road haul route in terms of bridging the West Coast Main Line. So there will need to be a level of construction traffic to support the creation of that haul route, even if it was to be off-road. Part of what this application is doing is creating that bridging of the West Coast Main Line to create that off-road haul route. And that was what one of the applicant's time detailed slides showed earlier on today. A refusal of this route pushes that timescale out. That means this work continues, but for a far longer time period, and potentially at greater cost, a greater disruption to the local environment and the residents of Balsall Common. I'll stop there, but I'm going to hand over to colleagues, if I may, Chair, in case there's anything I've missed.
Well, I'd like to just come back to you based on what you've said thus far. But before that, I have to tell you that every member, I'm sure, around this committee understand and are very appreciative of all the very, very, very hard work that all council officers do to move this wonderful borough forward. Don't misunderstand that. However, I have to say, in this particular instance, Mr. Andrews, you're wrong. I have got the, I thought I would bring it along with me. This is from the HS2 Rural Road Design Criteria PDF, and I'll quote it verbatim. 2-lane roads, the minimum width shall be increased to 6 metres for lengths and occasional use by buses or heavy vehicles, and 6.8 metres for roads where buses or heavy goods vehicles are likely to pass each other on a regular basis. There in black and white. So hand over to, is it Julia, are you going to speak, or Claire?
No, all I was going, but Mark's already covered it in terms of the assessments that would we approached Network Rail, and they confirmed that in June 2020, and it's on page 35 of your report in terms of the defects that were identified on the bridge.
Is that it, Julia? Thank you. Councillor Butler and then Councillor Caldwell, then I'll move to the vote.
Thank you, Chairman. And thank you, Mr. Andrews, for the explanation there. Just going back to the design guide for new roads, I think that again is quite key. And the reason that we have those design guides is for safety. And that's what we're talking about here is safety. And those design guides for new roads will apply to I guess, any road with normal levels of traffic. But these aren't normal levels of traffic. These are very much increased levels of HGV. So I guess the question is here is that why would we depart from something that is based upon good, safe practice? I struggle with that, but I think that has been superseded by the chairman's information regarding road widths anyway. So I shall leave my comments there. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Caldwell.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to make a couple of observations in light of what Mark's mentioned. That bridge may be in a bad state in 2020 when Network Rail reassessed it, but that's not when we were expecting to have the planning application in to use that bridge. That was discussed in 2016 when the bridge, presumably, even if it has deteriorated in the 5 years in between, would have been in a better position, would have been in a condition where it could have been maintained for the purposes of it facilitating that internal haul route. The second point I would just make about the notice to proceed is that yes, that was delayed until 2020. I don't think that that is a reasonable justification for taking shortcuts around how we facilitate that construction. Those delays, obviously they have knock-on impacts. I don't think that means we just say, oh, well, in that case, we should shovel these lorries through Balsall Common. That doesn't work for me. It's also not clear to me, and I sit on the IAG and I've seen some of what's been presented there recently. I don't know what that delay in the notice to proceed actually means, because we know that some things were happening before the notice to proceed. Could planning applications have happened? Could there have been some enabling works in place? We don't know. The lack of clarity around the presentations and the conflicting information that we've been given just makes it really hard for me to accept these applications at face value.
There was a question in there, so I am going to ask officers to respond if they wish. Will you be responding? Before, I'll give you an opportunity to come back in a second because Councillor Clements has indicated that she'd like to speak. So I'll come back to you, ladies.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be as brief as I can. I've listened intently to everything that's been said this evening, and I'm still yet to make my mind up because I think that there's still a compromise at some point, whether or not it's this evening. I'm not so sure now. But definitely on safety, I think that it certainly warrants my refusal, at least. But we haven't heard on the operating times, whether it's 7 days a week. I would certainly be in favour of it operating 9:30 till 2:30, maybe Monday to Friday, or even better, Monday to Wednesday, something like that. That's the compromise which I'm thinking of. But again, that might not get enough movements for HS2, what they're looking for. But knowing the rural residential houses down there, many people will be trapped in their houses, not being able to get out within the times where the movements are occurring. And I think, as well as the safety that's already been mentioned, that would initially be the reason why I would refuse this evening. But I do still think that a compromise could be found. The only other thing I was thinking as well, that I would have been all in favour of an internal line route. But then if that was put in front of us this evening, would we actually, depending on what would happen with that, what kind of impact would that have on the environment as well? So again, we haven't got enough information on that basis. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
I will hand over to our officers shortly, because there was the question that Councillor Caldwell asked, and of course Councillor Clements has raised questions over the operational times. So that needs to be answered. In terms, but to come back to Councillor Clements, we don't have an application in front of us for the alternative. What we have is an application in front of us that we must consider on its merits alone. Thank you. So, Claire, Julia.
Sorry, Chair. Can I just...
certainly, Aisha.
I just want to point members' attention to the guidance. And if I may, can I read a couple of paragraphs just so that it's clear in everybody's mind?
Please do. I respect your views, Aisha.
Okay, it's on page 19 of the pack in any event, and I'll start at paragraph 31 of the guidance, which states, as explained above, the Act grants deemed planning permission for HS2. The deemed planning permission has been granted on the basis of the impacts which were assessed and reported as part of the environmental statement in passing the Act. Parliament has judged such impacts to be acceptable when set against the benefits to be achieved by phase 1 of the scheme. Paragraph 32. The purpose of Schedule 17 is not, therefore, to eliminate all prejudicial impacts on or to secure the complete preservation of any sites within the various categories identified in the schedule. On the contrary, the operation of Schedule 17 is such that there will be cases where a submission must be approved notwithstanding identified negative impact unless there are modifications that are reasonably capable of being made. Now, I just want to stress on this point here that if we are minded to refuse, then we do need to seek modifications which are reasonably capable of being made in our reasons for refusal at least, so that that can be derived at. It's not just an outright refusal of this application. And it carries on to say, paragraph 33, accordingly, it is not open to the planning authorities under Schedule 17 to refuse in principle works or development which is covered by the environmental statement and approved by Parliament. The impacts have been assessed and planning permission has been granted on that basis. Instead, Schedule 17 offers planning authorities an opportunity to seek modifications to the details submitted, and they consider to reduce the impacts of a submission if such modifications can be justified. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Aisha. Julia?
Just to come back on the working hours point and other points really, in terms of the Code of Construction Practice, which forms part of the environmental minimum requirements of the Act, the HS2 are duty bound and contractually bound by the development agreement to adhere to. So the core working hours are 8 a.m. until 6 p.m. on weekdays, excluding bank holidays, and 8 a.m. to 1 p.m. on Saturdays. So it was just to make those points really, that those are the core working hours. And if any part of works were to occur outside of those hours, they'd need a Section 61 application under the Control of Pollution Act, to which they would apply to the local authority for consent for.
Thank you, Julia. And as I've already suggested, I'm going to move to the vote. The recommendation is one of approval. Those in favour of approval, please show.
No hands for approval.
I've been taking legal advice, and before I obviously put it the suggestion for refusal of this application, we have to be mindful of reasonings for that potential. You'll see, and Aisha's just outlined much of it, and on the bottom two paragraphs of page 19 and particularly the sentence, unless there are modifications that are reasonably capable of being made. So the feeling of the committee at the moment, I think, is for one of refusal. I'm going to suggest that we discuss potential wording to that. I would suggest that the reasons for refusal were to preserve the local environment and local amenity. Secondly, to prevent or reduce prejudicial effects on road safety or on the free flow of traffic in the local area, and are reasonably capable of being so modified. Can we just discuss that, members, before so that we're singing from the same hymn sheet? Thank you. Councillor Caldwell.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, as I mentioned in my thoughts earlier, the test of reasonableness, I think, is always an interesting one, because it's how do you define what is reasonable in any given domain. Now, my personal feeling is that it seems reasonable to me to reassess the state of the Truggus Hill Farm Bridge on the basis of the presentations that have been given to us this evening. Obviously, we've been told by HS2 Limited that Network Rail, and by our officers, that Network Rail are not happy with that bridge in its current form. However, the question of whether it could be reinstated to an extent where it could be used, subject to what we've spoken about before around one-way movements, which I think HS2 Limited and BBV are entirely capable of managing within their own perimeter of their site. I think that that is a reasonable option, and I'm sure if it gets refused, it will get appealed, and then it will be up to a judge to decide who's more reasonable. Is it us or is it the applicant? But it seems to me, like I say, that our MP, our parish councils all believe that that is a reasonable way forward.
Thank you, and those were my thoughts exactly, but I just didn't want to lead members in that direction. Councillor Goff.
Thank you, Chair. Just to let you know that I'm happy to support that position also.
Okay, so I'm going to put to members that we go to a vote on refusal of the application for reasoning to preserve the local environment of local amenity, to prevent or reduce prejudicial effects on road safety or the free flow of traffic in the local area, and are reasonably capable of being so modified. I don't think we need to do anything more than that, and with your permission, I would then ask if the exact wording to enhance what Councillor Caldwell suggested and what Councillor Goff has effectively substantiated as well, that you would be happy for senior officers, myself and the Vice Chair, to agree the final wording. So shall I go to the vote based on, and I'll repeat it if possible. Aisha.
Yes, thank you, Chair. That's fine. So the motion is one now for refusal, based on the reasons as suggested, and the detail of those reasons for refusal will be delegated to officers in conjunction with the Vice and Chair themselves. And that's the motion for you.
There's the motion, members. Please show if you wish this to be refused, subject to what we've just indicated. Those in favour of refusal.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That's unanimous, Chairman.
Thank you. The application is refused. Moving on to the next agenda item, which is the application for Station Road as detailed on page 43 to 60 of our papers. I'll hand over to officers to brief us on that application, please.
Thank you, Chairman. So this application takes the form of a certificate of lawfulness of proposed use or development under section 192 of the Town and Country Planning Act, and it seeks a formal determination as to whether planning permission is required or not for a proposed use or development. In this case, the development relates to works involving the creation of a site construction access for use by the applicant on land outside of HS2 Act limits. Have the next slide, please. So the main issue is whether the proposed works can constitute permitted development under Part 4, Temporary Buildings and Uses of the Town and Country Planning General Permitted Development Order. The merits of the proposal are not for consideration. Could I have the next slide, which this slide shows the location plan with the area of land outlined in red, and the dotted black line is the HS2 Act limits. The next slide shows the new site access, which starts at the traffic island at Station Road and Hall Meadow Road junction and connects with the internal Hall Road, which runs alongside the new railway line, and it provides access to various site compounds. The site plan illustrates the proposed layout and works proposed, which includes earthworks for the access and also mitigation bunds on land adjoining the main HS2 construction site. The next slide shows an aerial image of the land. And the next slide sets out the tests that need to be met. And in this case, it's whether the proposal falls within the criteria in Part 4 of Schedule 2, Class A of the Town and Country Planning General Permitted Development Order. And it's noted that the access road and associated earthworks required for mitigation fall within the works referred to in Class A of the General Permitted Development Order. The works are on land which adjoin the limits of deviation as authorised by the HS2 Act, and access is required to facilitate the HS2 development, which has deemed consent under the Act. The works are not mining operations, and that's a requirement for the works to meet this part of the schedule. The proposed duration of the works, 5 years, appears to be in line with the definition duration of operations being carried out on adjoining land, i.e. the HS2 project. Upon cessation of the use, the land would need to be removed and reinstated to its former condition to accord with the requirements of Class A. Following review of the information submitted with the application, on the balance of probabilities, the proposed development is considered to fall within permitted development rights, and it's recommended that the certificate be granted. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have we've moved to the registered speakers. First one being Mrs. Cooper again. I know I've told you before, Mrs. Cooper, you know where we are. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Application 00276, described as an application for lawful development, is anything else but lawful. The majority of the greenbelt land identified by HS2 Limited as the proposed haul route is not owned by them or under their control. Colechurch Properties Limited own the majority of the land identified as the haul route. They do not support the use of the land for temporary or permanent works. Barrett's Farm is identified for development in the emerging Solihull local plan as site BC1 Station Road. The proposed haul route is undeliverable. HS2 Limited submitted an application for permitted development, lawful development, on land they do not own or control, and which is also outside the scope of the HS2 Act 2017. Application 00276 is unsound. Any attempt by HS2 Limited or its contractors to enter the land without consent will be enforced with legal action. Affected residents living on Hall Meadow Road and Station Road have been subjected to worry by the loss of livelihood, amenity and the preservation of their health, safety and well-being due to the arrogant incompetence of HS2 Limited. Residents deserve answers. The failure of SMBC to obtain an environmental impact assessment has resulted in significant negative environmental impacts. The cumulative impact of flood risk has not been assessed. The negative impacts on the irreplaceable greenbelt environment, the loss of mature trees, wetland habitats, protected species, ecosystems and biodiversity are cumulative impacts which also preclude permitted development rights. Technical issues, logistical and design flaws built into the haul route plans, in addition to the above, confirm the proposals as undeliverable and unlawful. The entire episode demonstrates an all-time low for HS2 Limited. The implications are far-reaching and were entirely preventable. I ask SMBC Planning Committee to withdraw or refuse the unlawful application 00276. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Cooper. Your timing is wonderful. Mr. Lloyd.
Thank you, Chairman. If I could have my slides up, please. There's been mention of how the existing works were got underway. Could I have the next slide, please? That there was an act, I think it was 2013, the HS2 Preparation Act, which provided for all the preparation works necessary for carrying out the project. And in fact, it was well before 2017 that the ideas for a continuous haul route were put forward, and it was the middle of, 4 years ago at about now, that Berkswell PC tabled a clear proposal. So there's been 4 years in which that could have been worked up. Could I have the next slide, please? The concerns about the impact on Hall Meadow Road goes back to when Hall Meadow Road was constructed, and Solihull Council wrote to every resident of Borsall Common saying that it was an access road to serve the proposed housing development, and it would be subject to suitable traffic calming measures being approved to restrict vehicle speeds and discourage unnecessary through traffic. And that is the basis on which the people living on Hall Meadow Road bought their properties. And I don't doubt that if the HGV traffic is increased by a factor of 100 by approving a route through there, I suspect there might be some action taken over the loss of value of those properties. Could I have the next slide, please? I mean, the key thing that has come up in discussion is that the continuous route alternative is only 300 metres of roadway to be built, which HS2 aren't planning at the moment. It's actually shorter than the proposal in 0276. Could I go on to the next slide, please? And if HS2 really think that a temporary bridge is needed, then the top picture there shows what can be done putting a bridge across a railway. This is just standard construction practice. And the lower picture is a bridge which HS2, Balfour Beatty have built on the Coventry Road near Kenilworth. You can see it's a very substantial Bailey bridge just to go up a slight hill, and they didn't seem to have any difficulty building a temporary bridge there. So I don't know why it should be such a difficulty in Borsall Common. So if we just go on to the last slide, please. I think we've been over the grounds for refusal many times due to the impact and the unsuitability of Hall Meadow Road, and particularly the impact on the property Anora House, where this route on 00276 would go straight past their back garden fence, preventing them operating their business. We also don't have a clear commitment for reinstatement. It's said that this is to be a
Mr. Lloyd,
thing.
I am going to stop you. I am going to be consistent with,
Thank you, Chairman.
all this. Thank you. Next to speak is Mr. James Mumby. You have 3 minutes, Mr. Mumby. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, members. The certificate of lawfulness before the committee tonight seeks confirmation from the local planning authority that the proposed new construction access road off Hallmeadow Road benefits from permitted development rights under Part 4 of the Town and Country Planning General Permitted Development Order. As officers have set out clearly in their report and in their presentation the application is a legal test of whether permitted development rights apply in this instance. The works were in fact subject to formal environmental impact assessment screening process in May 2020. On the basis of that, no further EIA was required for the works, as reported in the Council's formal screening opinion. HS2 progressed this formal certificate of lawful application on that basis. The legal basis of these permitted development rights in connection with HS2 works has been reported to and established with the HS2 Phase 1 Planning Forum, which includes all planning authorities up and down Phase 1 of the route. The submission now represents the practical use of these powers to facilitate a new construction access to serve HS2 works, as you've been hearing. It should be noted that land ownership is not a relevant matter for consideration in this case. We know that the content of objections to the submission, however, none of these have challenged the legal test with evidence, which is the subject of the application and the Council's determination. And therefore, we ask the committee to support their officer's recommendation, please, to approve the certificate of lawfulness. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Lloyd, would you please turn off your microphone? Thank you very much indeed. We now have a statement to be read out from Councillor Kenilworth Ward Councillor.
Thank you, Chairman. There are three reasons for why this application should be refused. One, the application will result in Borsall Common and Berkswell residents having a loss of amenity, an increase in noise and air pollution, and increased danger to health, safety and well-being. This can be mitigated by a continuous trace line as originally proposed by HS2. HS2 should be made to stick to that trace line. Two, the unsuitability of Hallmeadow Road in terms of traffic will quickly constitute a statutory nuisance under the Environmental Protection Act of 1990, including noise, diesel fumes, mud on the roadway turning to dust, and an accumulation of deposits resulting in possible ongoing damage to air quality and subsequent health of residents. I do not believe that local roads in and around Borsall Common can accommodate the number of HGVs that HS2 Limited want to use on a daily basis. And three, during peak hours for movement to and from school, 8:30 a.m. to 9:30 p.m, or it should be 9:30 a.m, and 3:15 p.m. to 3:45 p.m, HS2 lorries should be prevented. For the above reasons, I feel that the above planning application should be refused.
Thank you. And finally on this matter, Councillor Andrew Burrow.
Thank you, Chairman. I've got the slide somewhere. If you could just turn to the first one. Thank you. This planning application is only being made because HS2 have not looked properly at the Trace Farm bridge. There was a meeting on the 14th of April this year attended by Andy Street and our MP, where they gave 5 reasons for why that shouldn't be the case. Firstly, they said the bridge could not take vehicles of 60 tonnes weight. Now, that's clearly absurd because the maximum road vehicle weight is 44 tonnes and they propose using 32-tonne tippers. So why they said 60 tonnes, none of us are clear. Secondly, they said the bridge parapets are in poor repair. That is probably true, but they've had years to repair them. Thirdly, the parapets would not be capable of containing an HGV if it hit them. Now, that is indeed a risk with bridge and stone parapets, and the engineering solution, as Councillor Lloyd has said, is to install containment curbing. Now, that containment curbing is used on the B4101, which is the road from Borsall Common to Coventry, which starts off as Waste Lane, on a single track bridge which jumps over the West Coast Main Line. So it's practice in the area on single track bridges. They also said that they couldn't get 200 vehicles a day across that bridge. They said too congested. Well, that very same bridge on the B4101 takes 1,200 vehicles a day each way, according to the traffic study from Solihull. Now, I'm sure if it had been the Royal Engineers, they'd have found a solution of how to sort out that bridge in 2 weeks. General Patton across the Rhine did it in a week. And BBV and HS2 have had 4 years to find a solution. And I put it to you that HS2 and BBV have simply not sought to find a way of using that bridge because they decided on a different solution, which they don't want to give it up. And I ask you to reject this planning application, which will go across the green belt and cause damage to the environment. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I move the motion, all of the speakers, without fail, referred to a planning application. This is not a planning application, and I would like our legal advisor to advise members on what is in front of us to consider. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. As you rightly identify, this is not a planning application. It's an application under Section 92 of the Act, and it takes a different form. Basically, it's for us to determine whether the proposed application falls within the permitted development rights. Now, permitted development rights are works that don't need planning permission. So it's for us to determine whether it needs planning permission or not. And in this case, we've determined that it doesn't need planning permission. And that's a legal test. That's been, that is the Schedules 2 Part 4 Class A of the GPDO. So in essence, what's happened is we look at the proposal and seek to identify each element of the proposal and fit it into the actual Class A of the order. And in this case, it fits. So therefore, there isn't really a debate on this in terms of the planning merits. It's purely a legal test. Does it fit or not? And like I said, it fits. So it's not a debate on the planning merits of this case. It's just a legal test as such. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Aisha. Much appreciated. As I certainly didn't want any confusion to our members. So it is my responsibility to start the debate. The Council's standing orders require me to move the motion. Although I'm moving the motion, I'm still undecided on how I will vote. The motion is recommendations for certificate of lawfulness of proposed use or development be granted. Do I have a seconder?
Formally second, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Davies. Councillor Goff.
Thank you, Chairman. Listening to the speakers, you know, there was some conflicting information. So I'd just like a little bit of legal clarification, Aisha, whether or not land ownership is a planning matter in this, or is a consideration under this?
No, it's not.
Thank you.
Very concise, Aisha. Thank you. Councillor Caldwell.
Thank you, Chair. And I think your request for clarification was exactly what we needed. I think, as you quite rightly say, there is not a debate on this. It is a legal test, and the application passes the legal test. So I would move that we actually get on with voting on this one, because there's not really a lot to discuss, and there is another substantive item under item 10 where I think a lot of these representations may have been better placed. Thank you.
Members generally happy? Then we will move to the vote. The recommendation is that certificate of lawfulness of proposed use or development be granted. Those in favour, please.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Unanimous, Chairman.
Thank you very much. That's been granted, therefore. Thank you. The next item on the agenda is the application at Hall Meadow Road on pages 65 to 98 of your packs. Over to our officers to brief us, please.
Thank you, Chairman. So this is another Schedule 17 request for approval, and it's seeking consent for a lorry route for a maximum of 200 two-way movements per day, travelling from the strategic road network along the A452 to Hall Meadow Road, and the outbound journey is the reverse of that route. If you could bring the next slide up, please? So it's the same grounds for consideration as the Waste Lane route, that the arrangements relate to development which has deemed planning permission under section 20 of the Act. The arrangements ought to be modified to preserve local environment or local amenity, road safety or fluid flow of traffic, archaeological or historic interest or nature conservation value, and are reasonably capable of being so modified. So the next slide shows the lorry route as it comes from the strategic road network, travelling south from the A452 from the A45 and turns left onto Hall Meadow Road. The next slide is a close-up plan of the lorry route, and it shows the end of the lorry route at Hall Meadow Road, Station Road, Traffic Island, where lorries would turn into a new access to the whole road to access HS2 work sites. And that construction site access is the subject of the certificate of lawfulness application previously discussed. So if I can show you some images of the traffic island, the first image shows the island on the A452 heading towards Borsall Common Village, and the left arm of the island is Hall Meadow Road. The next image shows the traffic island at Hall Meadow Road and Lavender Hall Lane, and here vehicles would take the second exit and continue on Hall Meadow Road. The next picture shows Hall Meadow Road at Grovefield Crescent Junction, where there's a speed table. The next image shows the junction of Riddings Hill and Hall Meadow Road, where you can see a second speed table. And the image also shows some of the on-street car parking on Hall Meadow Road. The next slide shows the Hall Meadow Road, Station Road traffic island, where the new construction access is proposed, and the dwelling immediately left of the island is 314 Station Road, Anora House. The new construction access is proposed to the right-hand side of this property, and it operates as a guest house. The next image is of Hall Meadow Road and Riddings Hill Junction as you travel away from the new construction access back towards the A452, so on the outbound route. The image shows the second speed table and also the relationship between residential properties and the highway. And to the right-hand side is the verge where the potential displacement of car parking is proposed. The next image is an aerial image of the residential estate and Hall Meadow Road and the speed tables at both junctions with Hall Meadow Road. The new site access is just off the bottom of the picture, and you can also see the West Coast Main Line running through the image to the south of the fishing lakes. So by way of background, Hall Meadow Road was identified in the environmental statement as a potential route for construction traffic, including heavy goods vehicles between 10 and 20 two-way movements at its peak per day. The proposal now submitted for consideration has been developed following stakeholder engagement in relation to concerns regarding traffic levels through Borsall Common. Looking at the grounds for consideration of this request, the work sites to which this lorry route is required are identified within the Act, so meeting Part A of the grounds for consideration. And focusing on local environment and amenity, key issues as detailed in the report are noise and air quality. Taking the data obtained for Waste Lane in close proximity to this route, it's reasonable to suggest that air quality would remain within recommended levels. And the route would also cover a shorter distance compared to the Waste Lane route with associated carbon savings. Looking at noise, there's two main issues, that from lorries using the highway, and in this case over speed ramps to residential properties, and also on the amenities of 314 Station Road, Anora House, from lorries travelling past this property. Being mindful of the impact on this latter property, it's noted that environmental minimum requirements and agreements with the local planning authority under Section 61 of the Control of Pollution Act require HS2 to undertake suitable mitigation to this and other properties to manage the impacts appropriately. In relation to the second ground for consideration, that of road safety and traffic flow, a temporary traffic regulation order is proposed to restrict car parking from Hall Meadow Road to allow vehicles to pass safely, and a conditions recommended to secure this. Whilst it may lead to parking elsewhere, officers don't consider that such displacement would be harmful to highway safety or environment or amenity. Your highway officers raised no objection on grounds of road safety or congestion, and as such, no modifications are considered to be needed or reasonable. HS2 Limited have confirmed that they would monitor noise levels between properties and the speed ramps to identify impacts and mitigate as appropriate, as well as liaison with stakeholders to explore alternative parking options for displaced cars on Hall Meadow Road as necessary. There's no material issues in terms of any sites of archaeological or historic interest or nature conservation value. The next slide, please, shows it shows how the two routes would work together in terms of Waste Lane and Hall Meadow Road. Just to make the point that Waste Lane would still be required even if the Hall Meadow Road route is taken forward, particularly during construction and demobilisation of compounds. However, once in operation, the number of lorries would reduce through the village centre, and I appreciate I am talking, you know, as if the Waste Lane route was going to be in operation. Whilst a small number of lorries would still need to use the Waste Lane route, the total number of lorries would not change. They'd be split between the two routes, but would remain at 200 two-way movements. Some of the additional information provided within the Waste Lane lorry route submission is also useful in terms of how it talks about how the two routes would work together and also predicted timeframes. This information has been summarised in your report. We've already spoken about the suggested alternative approach, the continuous off-road haul route put forward within the local community, and explained why this cannot be provided. And on this basis, the report details why, having regard to the parameters by which this lorry route request can be considered, the proposals are considered acceptable, and such the request is recommended for approval. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have a number of registered speakers excuse me, on this application. The first being Mr. Andy Hardwick. Mr. Hardwick, you have 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. I run an House guest house, and the whole route, as we've seen, runs adjacent to my home and business. And this proposal will close down my business. I can't expect people to book rooms 6 metres from a construction site like this. The proposed mitigation for us also is a total afterthought. There's a bending ridge which runs halfway across the garden, noise-reducing fencing which only covers a third of the garden, 20 metres of totally unprotected boundary where the whole route runs less than 6 metres from us. This whole route will reduce our household income to nothing, and HS2 refuses to acknowledge this, and I've got no recourse to compensation because I'm not affected by the track itself, just the whole route. Either their compensation scheme's not fit for purpose. Aside from this, I want to question the practicalities of the route. WSP, the highways consultants, have considered it and made the following points. The earthworks immediately to the southeast of Station Road appear to be very close or even cutting through my property. They believe there's not enough space to deliver the earthworks. The existing roundabout layout doesn't provide sufficient space between the junction's northern and southern arms to accommodate a new arm. Once again, works would require land from my property. The approach to the roundabout as currently designed doesn't provide sufficient deflection for vehicles entering. The entry path curvature would exceed the maximum value of 100 metres, which is considered a safety issue. Standard requirements for entry and exit are not achievable within the space available. Departure from these standards would have implications on the entry and exit at the whole route arm. The new arm would have a knock-on effect on the alignment of the other arms, specifically the southern arm, which already has substandard stopping distance on the approach coming past the Brickmakers Arms pub. And the whole route is designed as 7.3 metres wide for its first section, sufficient for 2 HGVs, and it then continues at 10 metres wide towards the site. This could suggest they anticipate larger vehicles than those assumed. HS2's argument is there will be too much delay to the project if the traceline haul route is considered. But if there's any impact on the critical path, can it be mitigated by arranging the order of other elements of the project? It's essential that any critical path impact is assessed for unavoidable impact on the start of passenger operations, not against contractor schedules and handover dates. The true balance of impact on rail passengers can then be judged against the safety of road users of Walsall Common or damage to the health of residents. This application must be rejected. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hardwick. Mrs. Cooper.
Thank you, sir. I've had to sort of do a bit of a rewrite, so it might be a little disjointed.
Is it shorter?
Possibly not.
Oh dear, you still have 3 minutes.
As I said previously, Andy Street, the West Midlands Mayor, also objected on our behalf, although we haven't actually heard his objection read out, which is disappointing. It would also have been extremely helpful if we could have had detailed information on why land ownership is not relevant. Failure by SMBC to obtain the required environmental impact assessments have massively, as I've already said, impacted on wetland and devastated ecology, biodiversity and ecosystems, and failed to address the wider impacts of flooding, which cannot be taken in isolation. They are cumulative and impact the entire project. Technical issues, design and logistics surrounding the use of Hall Meadow Road and Barrett's Farmers haul routes have been catalogued but failed to provide accurate and effective assessments of the proposed scheme, which is unequivocally flawed. The use of Hall Meadow Road will impact the crossing of traffic between the two villages of Berkswell and Walsall Common, also the access and egress from residential properties on Berkswell Gate and Reddings Hill, the health centre and access to Berkswell Station and Walsall Common Village. Furthermore, the route passes recreational facilities that children use, massively, the Hornets football ground and Lavender Hall Lane Park. Also the heritage property, the Brickmakers Arms. The temporary 5-year proposal is a guesstimate with no timeline guarantees. The code of construction practices already being broken on a daily basis, with complaints to HS2 either ignored totally or responses delayed. Many HGVs are not carrying identification as was promised and are not the promised Euro 6 fleet. Nothing has changed or will change. HS2 are a law unto themselves. I believe this application should also be refused and believe sincerely that there is something morally wrong and undemocratic about what is happening between HS2 Limited and the affected residents of Walsall Common and Berkswell. I ask you to refuse application 00473.
Mrs. Cooper, thank you very much. Before I move on to the next speaker, you commented on the representation from the West Midlands Mayor, Mr. Andy Street. Yes. That his office was contacted and asked whether a representation be read out. That hasn't been received, but his comments are noted within our briefings on pages 66 and 67. So I just wanted you to be aware of that fact, Mrs. Cooper. Thank you. Mr. Lloyd.
Thank you, Chairman. If you could put my slides up, please. On the question of the passage of time, I think it's worth noting that FOI inquiries have shown that HS2 Limited did nothing with the Berkswell PC proposal, and as of April this year, Network Rail said they had not been contacted by HS2. If I could move on, please. I'll try and get through this fairly rapidly because I think we've covered this. And the next one, please. As I said, there's been 7 years in which work could have been done with the HS2 Preparation Act covering any expenditure. Next one, please. And that is the Berkswell PC plan, which you've seen. So move on, please. And I think we've argued that the existing bridge would do the job, or a temporary bridge could go there. And I think there could be work done if needed. There really should not be a problem with that. If we move on, the question of impacts on Hall Meadow Road and whether or not they're going to be mitigated, a series of things could be done to reduce noise and dust and pollution and so forth. But if we move to the next slide, it is a question of trust. And if you look back at the track record of HS2 Limited in dealing with the area, they had an agreement signed with Solihull Council saying that they would minimise the loss of trees, and they have chopped down every single one and sold it for wood chip. They've said that they would consult on the closure of footpaths, and we finally had a meeting this morning. They said they would provide a temporary bridge on one of the footpaths, and they told us this morning that they weren't going to provide one, and that is in the environmental statement as one of the requirements to keep a footpath open. They've also said in the environmental statement that the Heart of England Way would be kept open, which has been closed for 3 years. And Park Lane has been closed for pedestrians as well as with vehicles. And again, in the environmental statement, it said that that road would be kept open for pedestrians. We were offered diversionary routes for another footpath going past 16 Acre Wood. The path has been closed and cameras put up to deter people going through that way, and no alternative provided. There's a clear statement to the Select Committee that HS2 were committed to providing temporary diversionary routes for footpaths, and none have been provided. And so it goes on and on. Next slide, please. So I think with the impacts on health and amenity and safety and the likelihood that mitigatory measures will not be followed, I think this application should be refused. Thank you, Chairman.
Absolutely perfect timing, Mr. Lloyd. Congratulations.
Practice makes perfect.
Mr. Payne, are you still out there in the internet?
Indeed.
Good. You have 3 minutes, sir.
Okay. If you can have my presentation, please. Okay, thanks. If we can go down then, please. And again. Yep. So, obviously the community, High Speed 2 and BBV all agree we need to minimise the impact on residents, schools and businesses, minimise the impact on traffic through Borsal Common and Burswell, and to minimise the use of the public highway. To do that, we need to ensure safety of all the above. And on the basis of this, we have looked at using this Hall Meadow route as an option to mitigate some of the impacts that have been brought out in the Waste Lane route. Whilst it doesn't eliminate it, it does look to mitigate the impacts on the village. Next slide, please. So, we will look to build the continuous haul route along the trace by using the permanent works, and the switching from Waste Lane to Hall Meadow would reduce the impact overall. We're also aware and have made commitments around parking, replacements, pedestrian crossings, and the noise impact arising from the speed tables. And we will work with SMBC and put in separate applications under Schedule 4 or TTROs to address those issues. We're also committed to providing noise attenuation for Nora House through ongoing compliance with our EMRs and negotiation with the owners. Next slide, please. This was a plan to show how the Hall Meadow would work in conjunction with the Waste Lane approval, had it been given, which reduces the amount of traffic and volume going down the Waste Lane route for over a year, and the majority would be switched to Hall Meadow during that period. Again, the overall time for constructing the permanent road, Hall Road, using the bridge would be Q3 23. Next slide, please. So just in summary, we believe the route offers substantial benefits to the community and reduces the number of receptors compared to the Waste Lane route. Whilst we acknowledge there are still impacts, we would seek to mitigate those as far as practical. The optimum solution is to create a Hall Road using the Hall Meadow lorry route, until the permanent crossing has been built over the railway and implemented. We've looked at the alternative details route by third parties, and we've demonstrated a number of occasions with evidence why it is not viable and will not deliver the desired outcome for the community. So no evidence has been brought forward to demonstrate that Hall Meadow lorry route arrangements ought to be modified on the grounds specified in Schedule 17 of the Act, and there's no evidence to demonstrate that these arrangements are reasonably capable of being modified. And therefore, on that basis, in line with the statutory guidance and the officers, we would look for the committee to recommend approval. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Payne. Councillor De Sico.
Thank you, Chairman, and members again. I wish to present an objection on behalf of residents to this application. The reasons that I'm objecting to this application are twofold. The first is highway safety concerns. I'm concerned that 200 HGV movements each way per day using Hall Meadow Road would pose a highway safety issue, as well as noise and air pollution issues for residents living nearby, and also to other local residents who use Hall Meadow Road. I do not believe that the local roads in and around Borsall Common can accommodate the number of HGVs that HS2 Limited and their contractors BBV want to use on a daily basis. I do not believe that other potential routes, such as the Hall route along the trace of the line using the Truggis Farm Bridge, which we discussed earlier, to cross the West Coast Main Line, have been considered in adequate detail. I've not yet seen a suitable explanation from HS2 Limited and their contractors BBV why this route is not feasible. I believe that such a route is feasible if HS2 Limited were to adopt certain working practices which reduce the operational strain on Truggis Farm Bridge. This option is a much better outcome for the residents of Borsall Common and Berkswell. If Hall Meadow Road were to be used as a haul route, I'd wish to see a condition added that its use should cease as soon as an alternative became available. I'm also concerned about pedestrian safety. This must be paramount. Some sort of pedestrian crossing should be installed to allow easy access to and from Berkswell Station. The second reason I object to this application is around safe parking in and around Hall Meadow Road. I'm disappointed that the current proposals from HS2 Limited do not allow for an overspill car park for users of rail services at Berkswell Station. HS2 Limited had indicated that it would liaise with Network Rail to install additional car parking spaces to cope with the vehicles that usually park in Hall Meadow Road and would be displaced if it were used as a haul route. Up until February this year, HS2 Limited BVB had indicated that it planned to extend Berkswell Station car park, which is much needed and would have gone some way to recompense the local community. This was taken off the table without adequate explanation, just as this planning application was submitted. HS2 Limited has indicated that additional parking on the verge at the side of Hall Meadow Road will be provided instead. It is not clear that this will be sufficient to cope with the overflow car parking from the station. This issue needs to be addressed to prevent vehicles being displaced to other areas of Borsall Common and Berkswell. We have already experienced the negative impact that this has had on residents living nearby. It must not be repeated. Finally, although local ward councillors have successfully lobbied for HS2 Limited to use only Euro 6 compliant vehicles for its construction work in Borsall Common, we are concerned about air quality in and around Hall Meadow Road if this application is approved. I would like to explore the imposition of a condition that would force a temporary cessation in vehicle movements if emissions of NOx and particulate matter reached safe levels. So I urge you members to reject this application for the reasons I've just given, and I thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor De Sico. And I believe we have a statement to be read by Councillor Richard Drake from Berkswell Parish Council.
Thank you, Chairman. An alternative haul route has been proposed and to date no convincing case has been demonstrated to its unsuitability. Mitigation. If the committee decide to approve this application, we request that the following areas of mitigation are required to be undertaken by the applicants. It should be noted that the use of Hall Meadow Road will deliver significant operational logistical savings and therefore material financial savings. These should be used in part at least to offset the impact on local residents. These mitigations were all agreed in principle by BBV at a meeting with local councillors on the 10th of June 2021. Vehicle movements. The applicant should be required to limit the number of vehicle movements to 200 at most and commit to further reductions when a continuous route is in place. In detail, a maximum of 200 LGV movements per day through Borsall Common across all routes. The numbers using Kenilworth Road, Kelsey Lane to reduce to 40 if and when Hall Meadow Road is in use. A maximum of 12 to use Truggis Lane. The maximum using Hall Meadow Road to fall to 40 once the trace of line route is operational. Parking. The applicant originally proposed to provide a temporary car park to replace the parking that has for many years made use of Hall Meadow Road. Their latest proposals are for 20 to 24 verge parking places only to be provided on Hall Meadow Road. This will not provide the necessary volume required and will lead to displacement parking elsewhere with considerable impact on residents' amenity and road safety. Therefore, the Parish Council requests that within any parking arrangements to enable free-flowing traffic on Hall Meadow Road, that restrictions on all-day parking on Station Road between the station roundabout and Sunnyside Lane, as well as the lower part of Ridding Hill and Grovefield Crescents be included. Pedestrian safety. Many pedestrians, including school children, walk to and from Berkswell Station along Station Road. It is imperative that they be provided with a safe and practical crossing point. Planting. The applicant should be required to work with SMPC to plant a shrub hedge along the western green verge of Hall Meadow Road to provide a dust and pollution barrier for pedestrians and cyclists. Footpaths. The applicant should provide a safe pedestrian and cycle link from Station Road to the temporary greenway. And that ends a statement of Richard Drake.
Thank you. That's the end of the speakers on this application. Therefore, it is my responsibility to start the debate. The Council standing orders require me to move the motion. Although I'm moving the motion, I'm still undecided on how I'll vote. The application is recommended for approval subject to conditions. Do I have a seconder?
Formally second, Chairman.
Thank you. Members, with your permission, I'd like to start the debate. There was a couple of things I picked up on both with the Parish Councillor statement and what Councillor De Sico said. In fact, I sort of winced when I heard Councillor De Sico, and so I'd like some clarification from officers. Parking on verges in Hall Meadow Road suggested by HS2? I think that's what Councillor De Sico said. And that, well, I'll ask for it. Can someone answer that, please?
Yes, Chair. It's been proposed that part of the verge on the eastern side of Hall Meadow Road be adapted so it could be used for car parking to displace or to mitigate for the loss of the on-street car parking.
Is there any suggestion of how that green space will be amended? Is it tarmac?
Chair, I understand that it'll be a grasscrete type product with a splay curb, so it to allow easy access up for the site. That will be subject to a Schedule 4 application. We haven't agreed any materials at this stage.
Forgive me, Mr. Tovey, thank you for that. But whilst you've not agreed, are you suggesting it's sort of this plastic that's green with grass growing through it. I'm no expert on this, but so I welcome your opinion.
You'd be looking at some sort of more substantial concrete, grasscrete to withstand the vehicle weights that would last that 5-year period, Chair.
Thank you very much. I think that there are conditions that could be added to this application, potentially, certainly in terms of the crossing of Station Road. I think certainly in terms of the parking facilities that I believe are now no longer going to be provided by HS2, as Councillor De Sico indicated. But I'll Councillor Caldwell asked to speak, so over to you, Councillor Caldwell.
Thank you, Chair. On its face, I guess this application could be seen to be marginally more meritorious than the Waste Lane application. However, I think that the reasonable adjustment that we said was the grounds for refusing the Waste Lane application apply in exactly the same way to the Hall Meadow Road application, in that there does exist an alternative that has been promoted over several years by the residents and the democratically elected representatives of those residents in that local area. We rejected item 6 on the basis that we felt that it could be reasonably amended. I think that reasonable amendment applies in exactly the same way to item 10. On that basis, I would be looking, well, at this time, I'd be voting to refuse this application as well on the same basis.
Thank you. Councillor Allen.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to look at the Human Rights Act and the paragraph in the reports about that. Following something I said at the last meeting, it has been changed. But it does say that in determining this request for approval, members should be aware of and take into account any implications that may arise from the Human Rights Act 1998. Under the Act, it is unlawful for a public authority to act in a manner that is incompatible with the European Convention of Human Rights. And then it says members are referred specifically to Article 8, the right to respect for private and family life, and Article 1 of the First Protocol, protection of property. It is not considered that the recommendation to grant permission in this case interferes with local residents' right to respect residents' right to respect for their private and family life, home and correspondence. The recommendation for approval is considered a proportionate response to the submitted request based on the considerations set out in the report. Now, according to the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, they state that the state has to take positive action so that a person can peacefully enjoy their home, for example, reduce noise and serious environmental pollution. I was just sort of going back to something that Councillor De Sico mentioned in his presentation. I just wanted to put that out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Butler. I beg your pardon, no, apologies, Councillor Butler, Councillor Gough, and then Councillor Butler.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll be very brief because I find myself in a position after listening to the speakers and especially Mr. Hardwick that I'm in danger of repeating myself as of what I said in the Waste Lane application. So I'm not going to repeat myself. I'm just going to say that the same concerns are there for me. And I would be in agreement with Councillor Caldwell that an alternative is on the table possibly. So I'll be supporting the position. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Butler.
Thank you, Chairman. I think that, much like my colleagues here, I think there are limited merits but significant problems. I find it interesting looking at the situation with Anora House. In the initial presentation, talked about identifying problems and then mitigating those problems. I struggle to see how we can mitigate the problems. We can put up funds around the house to help somewhat, but the fact of the matter is that we've still got a huge amount of HGVs passing in front of the property, and again on Riddings Hill, etc. We talked about identifying problems and mitigating. We have 2 speed tables at both access points, which means that the HGVs will be slowing. And as we all know, when HGV goes over a speed bump or a speed table, you get that huge bang and clash, etc. That's going to be right in front of someone's house. If there are other options here, I think they need to be explored. Again, I am struggling with this as per my colleagues' comments. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Hall-Allen.
Yes, well, I have to say, Chairman, I'm struggling a little bit too. And I think somebody said it goes on and on and on, doesn't it? And all these things seem to be being churned up. I honestly don't know which way I'm going to go on this at the moment. It is worrying me that this committee is finding itself, well, certainly I am, as one of it this evening, as a member this evening, very difficult to know exactly what's going on. All I could keep thinking of is this word neighbourly. You know, they were going to be really neighbourly with us all, weren't they? Or so we were told. And my apologies for the gentleman who's representing HS2, at least I think that's right, isn't it? Because I'm just being very careful as to how I'm going to say things, because I don't want to be offensive. But it does seem to me that all of a sudden the act has come, it's all been agreed through Parliament, and that's it. And I feel a little bit, Chair, that we don't seem to have an awful lot of strength, with the greatest respect to you as chairman of this, of course, and this committee, on this council, because there are certain things that are all through the debate and discussion this evening. We have been a couple of hours already, haven't we? We're being undermined all the time, and the local councillors, parish councillors, and speaking, we're being constantly, I don't know, being refute everything. They're just moving forward now. Somebody earlier on mentioned that you might not be here in 5 or 6 years' time. Well, I'm darn sure I will be, and I hope to be the end of this when it's finished. So I'm not going anywhere for a long time. That said, on a very serious note, you know, I was hoping things would go a little bit more smoothly, and I'm not finding that this evening. And I'm also finding it very difficult. As members will know, I'm normally very much in favour of developers more often than not. Because I think they have something to do, and they, you know, but I just feel what we're getting in front of us time and again this evening is they've stopped listening anymore, and not listening to the worries and the concerns of our residents at the moment. Where was the temporary greenway has not been constructed according to the design approved by Parliament as plans deposited Friday.
Councillor Hall-Allen, I think you've.
Have I skipped one?
I think you skipped one.
Oh, right. Sorry about that. Sorry, I have. I knew I had done that. Sorry. But it was further on. It seems to me anyway, that a lot of this, we should be very cautious in our decision this evening. I hear what our officers have said, and I respect that we're trying to do, but I am concerned that, I don't know, I think there's going to be more traffic going than we want, and I'm not sure that that's what we all agreed originally. And well, the agreement wasn't. It was definitely, was it 200, wasn't it? And I think we could end up with more if we're not careful. Anyway, I'm going to reserve my judgment, Chairman, because it is an important item, and so we'll see how we go. But I'm very concerned about certain things.
Thank you, Councillor Davis.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman, something the Planning Committee has always liked down the years has been to the Human Rights Act, and Article 8 in particular. And we've had various references to it over the years, and everybody has a different view on what actually it covers. But I would like to think that this Human Rights Act would help Mr. Hardwick, because I've got great sympathy for Honora House. Here we have a gentleman who's built up a business, and from what I saw as I passed today, it's obviously a good business. It's well maintained externally from what I saw briefly, and it's a credit to him. And maybe his other half, I'm not sure. But he has, as others do, have enjoyment of home and family life. In his case, it will be business, home and family life. And have we got the right, has anybody got the right to destroy somebody's business that has been worked up over so many years? It is clear from what we've heard and also what we've read in a number of places in this agenda tonight, Chairman, that his business would suffer considerably if this were to go through. And I'm a bit like Councillor Mrs. Hull-Allen. I'm not on the fence exactly. It's not my style, but I wait to hear if anybody else has got anything to add to it. But I'm looking at Honora House in particular on this one.
Thank you. I'm going to invite Aisha, our legal officer, to respond. I think she's likely to respond to the comments you've made by Councillor Allen and Councillor Davis. Aisha.
Thank you, Chair. Just to clarify about the human rights side of things, it is one consideration in the midst of all the other considerations that officers have and what you yourself members will be voting on. So it's a consideration. It's not a reason for refusal as such, because the reason for refusal is set out on page 77 for this item. And again, it's to do with the reasonably be capable of being modified. Whatever that element of it is. So it's not to do with the human rights of it. Human rights is just one aspect that you need to consider in every application that as a council we need to consider. Thank you.
Anyone else wish to speak before Councillor Allen?
And just to clarify that I never considered that we could refuse it on the Human Rights Act. I just wanted to point out the Human Rights Act and the impact that this proposal has on various people. Thank you.
Thank you. Do officers wish to make comment, Mark?
Thank you, Chair. If I may, again, I will make a few comments and then potentially if colleagues wish to add to, please do so. Okay. So I think firstly, so we started the evening thinking about the context of these applications linking and how they potentially work together. So we now have a situation, obviously, where the Waste Lane proposal has been refused, but notwithstanding that, as we advised earlier, that under the powers of the Act, that route can still be used to manage up to 24 vehicle movements per day. So there is still potential for some limited use within that route outside of the decision made this evening. What members, if I understand this correctly, what members have serious concerns about, and certainly did under the Waste Lane application, is the suitability and the availability of an alternative route that doesn't require either Waste Lane or Hall Meadow Road. Potentially, it's an off-road route. And we've talked about the merits and the issues associated with how that could be delivered, in particular how that would have to bridge the West Coast Main Line, and whether the existing bridge is suitable, or whether a temporary bridge can be delivered, and whether that's sufficiently justified and robust. And I think we can continue that conversation if members wish to a degree. I think what's important is that even if there was a temporary bridge to be constructed, or even if works are to be undertaken to refurbish the existing bridge, or even if we accept that a permanent bridge has to be created over the West Coast Main Line, there needs to be lorry movements bringing in and out material to create those works. So those lorry movements have to go somewhere in terms of how they access that part of the site. And there is a need to construct that haul route that off-road haul route. So those lorry movements have to come from somewhere. Now, we've seen through the first decision that the amount of lorry movements potentially on the Waste Lane route would be substantially reduced. The Hall Meadow Road route would offer an alternative to that, which would at least provide some lorry movements into the site that would allow the construction, the continued construction of that bridge. That's why it was originally considered by stakeholders and put forward as an initial alternative to the Waste Lane option in the first place. So that does offer that alternative. So then it's about whether, in order to support the construction of that off-road haul route, do the benefits of using Hall Meadow Road to help construct that outweigh the harm that it would otherwise cause? And I think you can then go back to comparing Hall Meadow Road in terms of how that performs relative to, say, Waste Lane. We look at road widths, for example, and members were rightly concerned about road widths in terms of Waste Lane, Trudgies Lane, etc. Hall Meadow Road is a far wider road. Yeah, yes, I would not debate speaker's comments earlier in terms of what that road may originally have been intended to do. Except that 1998, we were in a very different world in terms of what that road might have done. I don't know where HS2 was in 1998, to be honest. But we are where we are today in 2021. And the proposal is we have approximately 7.3 metre wide road with properties on one side of it set back approximately 40 metres from that road at an elevated position, as set out in the report. Paul will correct me if that's wrong in terms of road width. Approximately 7.3 metres. It's a wider road. It meets those design criteria set out by HS2. It's got an awful lot of capacity in that road, as is set out in the update note for you this evening as well, in terms of the evidence that's been provided. There is capacity and ability within that road to be used for LGVs to support the construction of the route in a way that doesn't create some of those same environmental impacts that members were concerned about in terms of Waste Lane. I think that's an important consideration. I just wanted to really flag that. Yes, we have a lot of concerns in terms of loss of car parking, on-street car parking along Hall Meadow Road, particularly insofar as it relates to the doctor's surgery, the health centre, and the station. Now, I think there's been a number of parking surveys and traffic surveys undertaken along that route over the last couple of years to look at what the impact of that could be and what the demand is for parking along that road. And the applicant has put forward a proposal whereby they would work with the local community, with the council, through a Schedule 4 application that would be determined by a local highways authority that would create bay parking, temporary bay parking along the grass verges that would help provide on-street parking to mitigate the loss of parking provision on that road, and therefore improving and managing the free flow of traffic along Hall Meadow Road without necessarily disrupting it as a result of parked cars. That is actually part of a TRO proposal which is conditioned to this decision. So a condition on using Hall Meadow Road for more than 24 vehicles would be subject to that Schedule 4 being approved. And that's a condition on any decision members may make this evening. I'm going to stop there because I don't want to waffle, and I hope that helps. But if colleagues do wish to add anything, please do.
No. Councillor Caldwell, and then Councillor Clements.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mark, for the clarifications. I think that, as I said in my original reflections, this route on its face has more merit, shall we say, than Waste Lane. However, what we've also said during our summing up on item 6 and the decision that was taken there is that there is a route that is yet more meritorious, which is the internal haul route that doesn't use any roads. My opinion is that as that is the reasonable adjustment that we've sought, we should now be waiting to see if HS2 accepts that. And as I've said earlier, I've got my views on that. And if they do, then they will bring back a plan for how to establish that internal haul route. And I don't think it's our job this evening to speculate on how many lorry movements that's going to be and where those lorry movements will go and whether those lorry movements require the Hall Meadow Road route to be in place. That's entirely conjecture. Now, as I understand it, there is already access to those lands off Park Lane. So it may be the case that those lorries don't need to come anywhere near Hall Meadow Road or Waste Lane or anywhere else for that matter. So whilst I take the point, I'm not sure that we should be being too previous on this one. I think we have to judge the Hall Meadow Road route purely on its merits. And the other point I would make around this is, as we heard earlier during the other speakers, the owner of Honora House gets no compensation for the blight on his property and on his business, because this is not a business that is directly affected by the route. It would be a business that's affected by an adjustment to a haul route over land that hasn't been acquired by HS2 under the Act. I find that really problematic. And on that basis, I still can't see my way to approving this application, because that seems like an affront to natural justice to me.
Sorry, Chair. Can I just say that
Yes, I should
compensation-
please respond to Councillor Caldwell.
compensation element isn't a material consideration for this application, so please disregard that in your decision making. Thank you.
Councillor Clements.
Thank you, Chair. It is a difficult one, this is. But as you come up the 452, I'll call it the bottom end of Balsall Common, as you come up and then turn left onto Hall Meadow. I know the area reasonably well. And it is a different animal to Waste Lane. I don't feel the same safety concerns to the same level as Waste Lane. I'm happy about the special conditions about the parking on Hall Meadow. I'm sure Mr. Tovey will be keeping an eye on things as they go forward. But to keep it brief, I had to weigh it up, but I will be looking to approve this application. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Butler.
Thank you, Chairman. This is proving very, very difficult. When I said earlier there are merits to this route, there are merits to this route. It skirts, if you like, it skirts the village. However, the big concern that I have is the gentleman sitting over there, and the impact that it is going to have on not only his business but him as a person. You know, we are going to thunder 200 vehicles past his house, feet away from his house here. And I'd like to hear more about what we can do to mitigate this. We have someone that is going to be so negatively impacted by this. I can't see how a noise button is going to provide enough mitigation. For that reason, I'm struggling, Chairman. Thank you.
Would officers like to come back on what Councillor Butler's just said?
Thank you. Yeah, so it comes back to the environmental minimum requirements and the Code of Construction Practice, which binds HS2 to secure appropriate mitigation on affected properties. So it is down to those mechanisms to be able to secure that. I mean, there are controls under Section 61 of the Control of Pollution Act where necessary, where the local authority would have input into approving, for example, out of hours work and that sort of thing. But it really does come back to the environmental requirements and the Code of Construction Practice, and not a matter for the Schedule 17 to intervene in towards.
Thank you. Councillor Davis.
Thank you, Chairman. Just looking at something here, going back to using haul routes, and I'm on page 71. Once the permanent structure on the HS2 trace is built over the West Coast Main Line, Hall Meadow Road traffic will be directed onto the Hall Road from Park Lane compound and use the permanent structure to cross the West Coast Main Line. Most traffic will then be removed from Hall Meadow Road and Waste Lane altogether. The question is, it's a 5-year programme, maybe longer, but we're going with 5 years. Which year will that happen?
I took that as a bit of a rhetorical question, Councillor Davis, because I don't think the there is an outline of 2025, but that is merely an outline. Sorry, Mr. Andrews, would you like to respond, please?
Apologies, Councillor Davis. If I understand your question correctly, it's at what point do the roads no longer need to be used to support construction traffic? Is that correct? Depending on what we approve and may not approve?
Yes, because they say they'll use the bridge
whole
over.
route event, yes.
But given that it's a 5-year project overall, in which year will they be able to start using that bridge?
Okay. So just referring, I'm just referring here, and colleagues, again, please correct me if I'm wrong. Just referring here to page 71 and 72 of the report pack, which set out the sort of the approximate phasing of delivery of the roads, the works, and the mobilisation and the demobilisation. At that point 4 states permanent structure built over the West Coast Main Line, Q3 2023. I think we would then enter a sort of a period of demobilisation around that. So it's probably moving on a little bit from there.
Councillor Cole.
Thank you, Chair. As Councillor Gough said, Councillor Butler said, there are merits to this plan, and to send all the lorries over a bridge that might not be able to take all those is a bit risky, I think. What I do think HS2 have missed at being a good neighbour is not to supply a extension to the car park in Berkswell. That would have left a legacy from doing this. So I'm really surprised that they've not done that, because this grasscrete is only going to last 5 years, and a station car park extension would last many more years. And I think they've missed the boat there. And after all, isn't the West Coast Main Line a railway line, just like HS2? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Did you indicate, Councillor Hall-Allen? Or thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Chair, because I found my page. You're quite right. I'd skipped a bit, because I think on page 96 and 97, there is a little bit of clarity as to the responsibility that HS2 have towards this project, or what we're looking at the moment. I think there's an element of trust, although I meant what I said. I was upset at the beginning looking through all these pages, really, because it's detail that we've been discussing for not months, not weeks, months and days, Chair, but years and years and years. And there are 2 or 3 people here who have been extremely devoted, and I have great respect for them. But I think really, in the recommendations on page, and both of the recommendations, I hope will cover what is being recommended, and I hope that the traffic regulation order is introduced on Hall Meadow Road. It's noted there, if you notice. I'm not going to go through each paragraph, Chair, but I think actually Councillor Clements just said, she's obviously looking towards approval, and I have to say, I think I am wavering a bit in that same direction, having reread the conclusion, Chairman. I won't go any further, but I was initially concerned about all this coming in after all this time, but there we are. But I just don't want to see any more increase in any more cars anywhere. And actually, what's just been said, I think that's unfortunate. We haven't done something round the station, as everybody knows, because there's always backing off down in front of the road, just going round from there is always being covered up. So we'll have to see how it goes. As you and I know, we've got a task of Finnish group looking at displacement of cars. So we'll have to see. Maybe we'll bring this up sometime in another place. So I'm wavering at the moment as to my decision, Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Tovey, you want to respond?
Thank you, Chair. I believe some of the discussion around the extension to the rail car park failed because of an access requirement through the station car park to actually maintain the railway, the West Coast Main Line. And I believe those negotiations couldn't actually get to an agreement over that. And then they started to look at the actual type of parking that was going on Hall Meadow Road, and then found out there was actually more being generated at that time from the medical practice, and people were unlikely to go into the station car park to then walk back to the medical car. They'd still try and park on the grass verges or in the adjacent side roads. So that's where this compromise solution came forward as the verge protection. for members. I did have another point as well I'd just like to cover for you. Obviously, members are looking at the approval of the route. There will be Schedule 4 applications to deal with the conditions that planning colleagues are looking to put on there. But I believe as part of the Schedule 4 process, the council wouldn't be putting itself in a position that would open it up for some claims for substantial damage to a property without having those indemnified by the applicant of the Schedule 4. Now, it might not be through the bill, but there'd have to be some other mechanism to make sure that the council wasn't liable for any impact on the property. Just I wouldn't like Aisha's view on that, but I'm not sure whether Aisha's an expert on Schedule 4. But I'm getting a nod on that. But I believe certainly if we were in the approval of the Schedule 4 process, we certainly wouldn't be allowing highway improvements that would potentially bring a financial liability on the Highway Authority.
Mr. Andrews.
Thank you, Chair. And I think just to follow on from that as well, Chair and members of committee, obviously it's referenced within your reports, and I think Julie has mentioned it earlier as well, about the requirement to have a Section 61 agreement under the Control of Pollution Act, which will help us assess the details of any scheme that actually connects that Hall Meadow Road junction through onto the Hall route. So there will be a detailed scheme that is to be worked up by the applicant to actually implement that and bring that forward. And as part of that, key part of that is ensuring that that detailed scheme is assessed against the Code of Construction Practice, the environmental minimum requirements, that the mitigation measures that are needed and that are required to protect the amenity of Anora House are covered. And that can be assessed by the local authority under Section 61 of the Control of Pollution Act. So that's outside of the planning arena, but there are those controls there. And I personally think, and again, if colleagues were closer, they'd probably kick me under the table if I'm wrong, but we could put that as an informative on any decision members wanted to make. It's there in black and white within the Code of Construction Practice and the information that supports the Act. But as an informative, we can highlight that to the applicant to remind them of their responsibilities under those duties, which of course I'm sure they're already aware of. But
Thank you. Hall Meadow Road is, as we've already said, a much wider road than Waste Lane. It's a particularly wide road. Where and Mr. Tovey just said that there's more parking at the health centre than there is on the station car park, but of course the health centre is on one side of Hall Meadow Road. The station is on the other side of Hall Meadow Road. How does one get from one side to the other? So I refer back to the request for a zebra crossing. Should my members be minded to approve this application? So I'm just trying to explore, and Mr. Andrews has mentioned an informative, that if members were minded to approve, perhaps we should be considering some more conditions that HS2 have to honour. Thoughts? Councillor Allen, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Grinsell. I'm with you, don't worry, I've got your back. Yes, there does seem Mr. Tovey has actually suggested that Anora House will be, sort of looked at, and it's not forgotten, which is under the Schedule 4, which is which is a good thing. And also, if we can condition or do an informative about a zebra crossing, is that possible? That's the one thing, because we keep being told that we can't add conditions to what's already already in here. So is that a possibility? or would that come under the Schedule 4 again?
Mr. Tovey is indicating he'd like to answer that question, Councillor Allen.
That would be lovely, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm a little confused over the location because the Chair talked about between the parking and the medical centre, which is across Hall Meadow Road, and I think members of the public talked about Station Road. So there's no footpath on the opposite side of Hall Meadow Road to create a crossing point 2. There certainly is across Station Road, or even the new access into the Hall Road, which will be the conflict point if people are walking down to the station. Does that make sense, Chair? So those are the two locations I expect to see a crossing point, either Station Road between the Brickmakers Arms and the roundabout, so that we can get across the extra traffic going that way, or across the new access road. But Hall Meadow Road has no footpath to cross people to, other than the 20 people that park their cars at 7 o'clock in the morning. So a crossing facility would be no benefit really for them because there's nobody using that road at that time of the day. But it's something we could be delivered through the Schedule 4 if we put the condition on.
How about 2 zebra crossings? Sorry, Councillor Cole.
Thank you, Chair. You just stole my thunder there. I was going to suggest 2 zebra crossings, so one to you there. The other thing is you've got this grasscrete there. I mean, if it, you know, there should be something going back to the community here. Can't we look at something a bit more permanent? Because you said this grasscrete will only last 5 years. I mean, come on, it's they're going to have all these lorries going down Hall Meadow Road. Give them something back, something more permanent. Extension to the car park of the station for one.
Councillor Butler.
It's going to turn into a bidding war, this, isn't it? Mr. Tovey, I think you're probably best suited to examine where the crossing should go. Your knowledge is far greater, but I agree. That's one thing. You know what my struggle is with this. It's the Enora House situation. I think, you know, I'm happy with the route. I'm not happy with that aspect. You know, whether it could be moved, you know, slightly away from the property. I noticed we've got some waste-ish land, you know, as we move away from it. I know it's slightly off the island, then that produces problems there. But you know, I think that can be addressed under the Schedule 4, maybe as to what mitigation we can put in to help the gentleman here. Again, whether that is enough for me to vote against the route, possibly not. But I am deeply concerned about that particular property. But again, I'll leave that to Schedule 4. I think that's something that we can have a look at as we move forward. So thank you.
Before you come back, Mr. Tovey, I'm probably going to steal your thunder now, because on page 97 there is a note. The applicant is reminded to fulfil its obligations to carry out monitoring of LGVs in order to reasonably reduce any environmental and amenity impacts on Enora House. Have I stolen your thunder? Well, please carry on.
Part of it, yes, sir. Chairman, as well, also give the example which is linked to your next item, bringing into use of Kenilworth Greenway. As part of that process with the Schedule 4, we carry out a pedestrian crossing assessment, which then led to the Pegasus crossing being installed rather than a courtesy crossing. So we do a similar process here through the Schedule 4 development process. We look at all the design guides, we carry out the assessments of pedestrian movements, and that would lead to a conclusion of where the pedestrian crossings were required or not. And certainly that would be through the Schedule 4 process.
And that would be undertaken from a cost point of view by HS2 Limited. Thank you.
Correct.
Just wanted clarification of that. Anything else, members, before we move to a vote? Do we need, so if you were minded, do we need to consider further conditions if you were minded for approval? Councillor Cole, you're suggesting the extension to Berkswell
Station,
car park.
Something permanent with the grasscrete and maybe a couple of zebra crossings.
Mr. Andrews, you seem as though you want to do it. Well, no, Mr. Tovey wants to comment.
Apologies, Joe. If I could just clarify for Councillor Cole, the 5-year period for the grasscrete was the duration of the construction period, because this is a temporary route, so we wouldn't be needing the parking measures beyond the construction period. Not that the grasscrete will last much longer than 5 years if it's required for longer.
That's fine.
Is that fine?
Okay.
But we're still talking about extension to the station car park and zebra crossings. As Mark, would you like to come in?
I think just in terms of the extension to the station car park, I think Paul made a reasonable point earlier just around in terms of how that's managed in terms of the maintenance and ongoing maintenance access for the West Coast Main Line through that particular site, which is part of the reason that has been ruled out at this time. Whilst I don't want to get in the trials and tribulations of what is in the draft local plan that is obviously going to public examination later this year, there is obviously an infrastructure opportunity there to look at as part of wider development within the area to potentially extend the car park in that location. But that is part of a wider master plan form of development. It's not something on a short-term fix when there are those maintenance considerations to be had as part of the West Coast Main Line. Just thought I'd clarify that. It's something to consider in the future, but at the moment it's not a reasonably deliverable option.
Councillor Cole.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just looking at some sort of legacy, that's all. Not asking for it now, but maybe a commitment, a written commitment that they would look at this in the future. That would make me happy.
Would you be happy with an informative on that basis? So, therefore, I'm going to put this application to the vote.
Sorry, Chair, can I just interject here for a second?
Always, Aisha.
If we're going to add a condition, then the matter needs to be deferred because the condition needs to be approved by HS2 before it has to be added with agreement of HS2. However, if you're going to add informatives, then we can do that.
No, Councillor Cole has agreed that he'd be happy with an informative on that, Aisha. So, therefore, the application before us is approval subject to conditions plus any informatives that we've discussed. Those in favour of approval, please.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Those against?
1, 2, 3, 4 against.
Thank you, that's carried. We've now sat here for 3 hours, 20 minutes. I'm going to call for an adjournment until 9:30 for a comfort break. I certainly could use a comfort break. Can I remind people who are attending this virtually that they should remain on the webcast but they're perfectly, and turn their microphones off and their pictures off. Thank you. 9:30, back again, please. Can we, it's now past, can we reconvene, please? I'll give you a few moments to get seated. Thank you, everyone. We now move on to the final item on the agenda, and that's in respect to the application for Kenilworth Greenway, pages 101 to 112. Officers, can you please give us the briefing? Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. This Schedule 17 request seeks approval for the bringing into use of the temporary diverted Kenilworth Greenway under paragraph 9 of Schedule 17 of the High Speed Rail Act. The purpose of bringing into use approvals is to ensure that the nominated undertaker takes all reasonably practical measures for the mitigation of the work. Have the next slide, please. So under paragraph 9.4, approval must be granted if no reasonably practicable measures for mitigating the effect of the work on the environment or local amenity need to be taken, or the local planning authority has approved a mitigation scheme submitted by the nominated undertaker. Next slide, please. And paragraph 9.5 defines the grounds for determining or imposing conditions on mitigation schemes. The relevant planning authority may not refuse to approve or impose conditions on the approval unless it is satisfied that the scheme ought to be modified, A, to preserve the local environment or local amenity, B, to preserve a site of archaeological or historic interest, or C, in the interest of nature conservation, and that the scheme is reasonably capable of being modified. Next slide. So the temporary diverted Kenilworth Greenway is a Schedule 1 work in the Act, and the suitability of its route was assessed through the environmental statement. The limits of deviation, or otherwise known as Act limits, included a 10-metre corridor to allow for the construction of the diverted path, and its alignment is shown on the plan on the screen in pink. The blue line shows the proposed railway line, and there's a dotted green line that shows the original path, and you can see that the new railway is on more or less the same line as the original greenway. Next slide. So now moving on to some images. This one is taken at the Berkswell station end of the path, where a turning area for horses is provided. The diverted path stops short of Station Road, as does the original path. However, there are existing public rights-of-way that connect to the end point. And there's also an undertaking and assurance for the Greenway to be ultimately continued to Station Road. However, this falls outside of the scope of this bringing into use request, as it does not form part of this Schedule 1 work. Next slide, please. This image shows a typical section of the path between Berkswell Station and Waste Lane. To the left-hand side of that image is land identified for HS2 to use for construction purposes. And to the right-hand side, there are agricultural fields. The next slide shows an image of some additional mitigation that was provided to prevent water running off the fields onto the path, which is on the left-hand side of the picture. The next image shows the crossing at Waste Lane. The surface material here is tarmac, and you can see the path is wider as it approaches the holding bays, and there's also a horse mounting box. Just before the road crossing is a vehicle restraint barrier. Schedule 4 consent is also required for the crossing as it affects the public highway. Next slide, please. This image shows the beginning section of the path between Waste Lane and Cromwell Lane, where there's a section of close bordered fencing alongside a section of highway and also residential property. The typical fencing is shown on the right-hand side. Next slide, please. This picture is also taken between Waste Lane and Cromwell Lane, which shows where there is a bench located along the path. The section of the path has more turns than the northern half, and this this image illustrates the visibility that the fencing provides. The final image shows when the applicants undertook a walkthrough of the path with a horse. Road safety audits have been undertaken, which over time have identified problems, and the designers have responded to these with solutions. Next slide, please. So the main issues for consideration are set out within the report. These include whether the diverted temporary path is fit for purpose in terms of local environment and amenity, and whether the mitigation proposed needs modifying. Modifications have been requested during the assessment of the request, including minor changes to the drainage. The report covers how these issues have been addressed, and no additional mitigation over and above what has been provided and that covered under the environmental minimum requirements is considered to be necessary. In accordance with the Act, in accordance with what the Act allows the local planning authority to consider, it is recommended that the Schedule 17 request is approved.
Thank you, Claire. We have two registered speakers. Mr. Lloyd.
Thank you, Chairman. If I could have my slides, please. This is a case of over-promised and under-delivered. We were promised a temporary substitute would be of the same standard as the much-loved Kenilworth Greenway. The taxpayer has paid hand over fist for this, and what we've got has been built without proper public consultation, which they cut off a couple of years ago, and they failed to put in a planning application despite promising that they would in advance of the works. The next slide, please. The 10 metres width of the current greenway comprised a relatively narrow surface strip for cyclists, and then there was a grass verge for horses, and the rest was for landscaping. What we've got, if the next slide, please, is a 2-mile long prison corridor with fencing going up to head height, and 4.5 acres of public land has been fenced off to grow weeds. And the seats are positioned actually within the working width of the actual track, so you're going to get your legs run over by cyclists or horses if you're not careful. Next slide, please. The style of fencing is impermeable to wildlife, which is an undeclared environmental impact. It will snare and kill animals and prevent migration. And the next slide, please. And on top of that, we've got a forest of signs going up into the sky. The old Greenway just had a few odd little signs saying share with care. And what else does one need on a route like that? And then the road crossings, there are 9 full-sized columns for each of the road crossings. And you wonder what on earth is going on in terms of the visual appearance. So we go to the next slide, please. This scheme needs to be heavily modified, that it needs to be made wildlife friendly. There are proven designs that will allow wildlife to go through the fences. The inner fencing, which is so oppressive to walk along, should be removed entirely so that the public has got access to all of the land and it can be properly maintained. The seats should be put onto grass verges. The unnecessary signage should be removed. There are gates giving access to it which aren't disability friendly. They need to be removed because they're not serving a purpose. And the surface and drainage still needs further improvement. And of course, some landscaping rather than weeds would be appreciated. And there's no maintenance plan. It's unclear who this actually belongs to, apart from HS2 Limited. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Mumby.
Thank you, Chair. The proposed bringing into use application before the committee tonight has been submitted under Schedule 17, paragraph 9 of the High Speed Rail Act to demonstrate that reasonable and practical mitigation has been provided to mitigate any impact on local amenity, the local environment, sites of archaeological or historic interest and nature conservation as part of the construction of the temporary diversion of the Kenilworth Greenway. Members of the committee may be aware that the works are identified in Schedule 1 of the HS2 Act and provide a 3.53 kilometre temporary diversion of the existing Greenway route, which crosses Waste Lane, Hob Lane and Red Lane, in order to facilitate the construction of the HS2 line. It is important to reiterate that the temporary diversion of the Greenway forms part of the scheduled works of the Act, and as such, the temporary diversion works are authorised and also already benefit from deemed planning approval under Section 20, Paragraph 1 of the HS2 Act provisions. Throughout the Schedule 17 bringing into use application process, HS2 and its contractor LM have held extensive and collaborative consultation with the local planning authority, with consultees and stakeholders, which included officers conducting a site walkover of the diverted Greenway in March 2021, as you heard earlier, demonstrating that the extent of the mitigation is appropriate and proportionate to this temporary work. It has now been demonstrated that all reasonable and practical mitigation measures have been provided for public use of the diversion, and as such, there are no grounds under Schedule 17 of the Act to withhold consent. So, on that basis, I would now ask the Planning Committee would fully support this application to positively determine the request for bringing into use of the Greenway diversion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It is my responsibility to start the debate. The Council Standing Orders require me to move the motion. The motion being, or the recommendation being approval of the request for bringing into use and related mitigations. Although I'm moving the motion, I'm still undecided on how we will vote. Do I have a seconder?
Formally second, Chairman.
Councillor Davies, thank you very much indeed. Members? Councillor Butler.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a point of clarification. It might be, my naivety here, but this is a temporary path. So on the plan where it shows the blue line as the route of HS2 and the dotted green line is the current Greenway, is that correct? And the red line is the temporary path. So once HS2 is, I don't see where it's going to go back to. If the red line is the temporary path, where is it going back to?
Councillor Butler, I know where you're coming from, and I know that Claire Bishop is only happy to give you clarification of that point.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, the path is temporary, and there will be a permanent realignment of the path that will come forward through other Schedule 17 submissions at a later date, and that will be more akin to the original path in location.
Could we put the presentation up again to just clarify the routes for Mr. Butler, Councillor Butler? Claire, would you care to?
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, so the temporary path is to allow for the construction works to take place whilst still having a path available. Once the construction works are finished, the Greenway, there will be a permanent realignment, and that will, as I said before, that will come forward through further Schedule 17 submissions later on.
If I may, Chair, can I come back on that, if possible? Thank you for that. I understand the matter that we're dealing with here is the temporary path. I suppose that the spin-off that I have here is that once we revert back to that realignment, from what I can see, we're going to align it with or next to the track, and the concern that I have, and forgive me for going into the detail here, and again, I feel that I'm digressing, but it's worth a mention here, is that we're going to have certainly horses, etc., that are going to be on a greenway next to a track with trains going past them at 180 odd miles an hour. I think that needs some consideration. But thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Any other members wish to ask questions? Councillor Caldwell.
Thank you, Chair. I'm glad that we've got that slide up because that's what I wanted to talk about. Just for my own clarification, I assume it's the west end of the path and that map is oriented with north up. How does one actually get access to the temporary greenway? Because I can see it joins the existing run of the greenway at the east end at Red Lane, but how do we get to it from the west side? It seems to sort of end in the middle of a field or something. Is that right? Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, the plan does show the existing greenway extending to Station Road. It does stop at more or less the same position as the diverted path. And then there are public footpaths that connect to the greenway. It's always been like that. Now, as I said in the presentation, there is a undertaking and assurance that there will be an extension of the path to Station Road that will come forward at a later date to allow for multi-users to get to Station Road from where the horse turning area is. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Councillor Goff.
Thank you, Chair. I listened to Mr. Lloyd's presentation and looked at his slides and was thinking he's got a good point when it comes to the quality of the work that's been done. But on hearing that it's temporary, I'm happy to support the position. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Goff. I'd like to make an observation to what Mr. Lloyd said, and we do have information in our pack in respect to the maintenance of the temporary greenway and to the ownership. And I'll read it. This will be the responsibility of the applicant, HS2, to manage through their own agreement with the owners of the path, Warwickshire County Council, to which Solihull Metropolitan Borough Council are not party to. It's a pity that we're not can't influence that in some way, shape, or form, but I will make a statement afterwards. Someone was it, Councillor Cole? Did you indicate? Sorry. Oh, sorry, Councillor Clements, you indicated.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, just one question. Has the British Horse Society given any kind of representation about the suitability for horses and any recommendations?
Claire.
Thanks, Chair. The British Horse Society are not a statutory consultee to the submission. However, we have been in touch with them and they have advised that they are satisfied with the width of the path. In terms of the vehicle restraint barrier, they haven't specifically commented on that, but there have been the road safety audit reports for the crossing and it's not been identified as a concern under those audits.
Thank you. Councillor Caldwell.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, so I think just to share my thoughts on this doesn't look like a very appealing alternative to what was previously in place. However, I do take the point that I think some of my fellow committee members have made, which is that it is a temporary provision. My only slight disappointment with this is that we're being asked to bring this into use without knowing what the future state is going to be. It would have been nice, I think, when we were discussing what this temporary path looks like, to know what the future is going to be. And I think the point, I'm not sure who made it, about horses being next to a 200-mile-an-hour railway line is very valid. However, I don't see any grounds to refuse this evening, so I'm minded to vote for it.
Thank you. Before we go to the vote, I'd like to sort of make an overriding comment, please. And we've seen it throughout the evening of not just this application, but on other applications. The applicant hasn't appeared to be a good neighbour. To quote Mr. Lloyd, overpromised and underdelivered. I hope, and I think I'm speaking for every single member of this planning committee, that the applicant takes on board what we have said here and what representations have been made, that we will make decisions based on what is best for Solihull and its residents. And I sincerely hope that there is a much greater dialogue from here on in. I think I'll leave it at that. I've said my piece. I think I've said it on behalf of the whole of the committee. I see lots of heads being nodded, and I hoping that you've heard what we've said, and I see heads being nodded there too. So we'll bring this application to the vote. The recommendation, when I can find my page, is approval of the request for bringing into use and related mitigation. Those for, please.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Those against?
1 against.
Thank you. The application is approved. Everyone, both online and present, thank you very, very much for your time and indulgence this evening. That brings us to the end of the meeting. Have a safe journey home. Good night.